Colleagues, we'll start in just a moment. Welcome to the first meeting of the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee. We're delighted to have everyone from the gallery, certainly staff and colleagues around the table. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing committee, or advisory committees, meetings, and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. To make a request specific to this meeting, please contact sppc@london.ca. The intention of the committee, if required, is to recess at approximately 6:30 for dinner, should that be required. I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Councillor Turner.
Your Worship, the budget has not yet been tabled, but as we move through the budget process, I will continue to declare pecuniary interests with anything respecting the Middlesex London Health Unit budget and any transfers associated with Child Reach. As I'm an employee of the organization and my wife is an employee of the other organization.
So noted. Thank you very much. Any declarations? Other declarations? Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, Mr. Chair. As we start the budget process, I would like to declare, recuse myself from anything pertaining to Union 107 as my son is employed with the City of London.
Thank you very much. Any other declarations? Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Thank you, Mayor. Anything to do with childcare, as my wife operates her own childcare facility. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pelosi.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll declare a conflict of interest when anything arises dealing with YMCA funding, as my husband's employed by Good Life Fitness and it's direct competition.
So noted. Thank you. Any other declarations? Seeing none, colleagues, I'll move to the consent agenda. As I do, you'll note that in the added agenda, we have a request for delegation status from Mr. Chris Butler, and I would like to ask if there's interest from the committee in hearing the delegation, and if so, would you indicate so, please? Councillor Turner? Moved. Is there a seconder? Councillor Helmer. Thank you very much. I presume your request is to hear it now, although we have the option of hearing that later, but I presume that's your intention, Councillor Turner?
Your Worship, if there was something from staff coming forward on this prior to hearing delegations, then we'd hear that. Otherwise, if we're just taking the report and receiving it, then I would think it's probably appropriate for Mr. Butler to speak at this time.
Understood. Is Mr. Butler here? As we call you down, the first thing is we're going to vote on that motion to receive Mr. Butler for delegation. I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 13-1.
So with that, is Mr. Butler in the audience? Would you please come forward and, yes, that would just be forward. Yeah, you don't want to go much more forward than that. It could be awkward. So please, to the microphone if you would, and if you wish to share your address, you're welcome to. You have 5 minutes, sir, please.
Thanks very much. This is with respect to mostly the DC side of the report that's in front of us. I just had a couple of questions for staff and then a couple of insights for council, because I did attend the July 29th meeting and another budget meeting, and this is pretty dear to my heart on the DC stuff. So staff, I'm looking for Graham, I think.
Could I just indicate, through this process, it's your presentation, sir, and we don't have the gallery direct questions to staff, but certainly
okay.
they'll report back through to us, and if you have comments, we'd certainly look forward to receiving them.
Just a comment on the $500,000 reduction in the DC side, the residential. I looked at the report, and I'm a little unclear as to whether this is a reduction in the demand for this program, or it's just a cash flow change from pay it immediately to the 10-year program we had. So I'd like an answer to that question if I can.
And any other comments, because we're going to take your comments in your time now, and we'll determine if staff's in a position.
The
to
other
respond.
quickly, as I looked at it, if this is just a reduction in taxes forward and budget forward, I can't see how staff can claim this is a savings. This would be, to me, a cost, not a cost reduction, it's just spreading the cost. It's not a cost savings at all. So on to council with this in terms of the perspective of the program forward. I also see that in 2017-18 that we've had a service review, and I was with this for part of the meetings, and we came up with $620,000 worth of savings there. And then next year's, we're going to come up with a cost avoidance of $500,000 for budget. You would think that the year in between, which is linear, 2019 now, there'd be another $500,000 to discuss at this table, and I'll leave that for council to question the appropriate people on that. That would be a real savings. In terms of being a taxpayer, I'm somewhat challenged with this program. I drive around downtown, I've seen it going for about 6 years, and to be honest, I'm seeing a lot of purpose-built condominiums being built with this fund, with commercial property on the first floor, and these are twice the value of an average taxpayer's assessed value this year. And for us to continue to do this, it's a bit lopsided, to be honest. I see the ground changing below council's feet. We have different priorities as we're being developed, affordable housing, all kinds of different things, certainly rental. And I don't see that part of this program as being something that this council wants to consider going forward. It's unfair to taxpayers, and I think going forward, it doesn't match anything we want to do. I spent a few minutes online today looking at Kitchener-Waterloo Cambridge website. They have a mirage of projects, different ways to pay for them, but certainly nothing that's targeting, that I can see, built for sale condominiums. And that's the thing that I want to get across to council today. I think it's fairly urgent that we ask staff to get the review done on this so that we can reset the program going forward to something meaningful for taxpayers and council that targets things a little more effectively and maybe looks outside the building a little bit for some answers in terms of what we got. There was lots I learned from the Kitchener-Waterloo site today. There wasn't a lot that did full DC. They took brownfield away from DC in some cases. There was lots of different answers that we can look for outside the city that can apply to this particular program, especially on the residential side. So all I'm really asking council in this meeting is to look at urgently turning up the burner to get this review done, some meaningful metrics to look forward to, and I as a taxpayer would feel more comfortable if we moved forward on the things that are becoming set for council. I would tend to, being a project manager in the past, to build a little picket fence around this program, the DC one, and look at maybe not assigning any more budget to this particular part until staff gets back and looks at both the metrics and the program going forward, and that matches what council needs. That's a very prudent thing to do. We used to use that at all kinds of programs, essentially. It protects the customer, in this case the taxpayer, and it protects the city as well because you're not spending money you don't need to spend going forward. So I appreciate the chance to put this forward, and I certainly share the enthusiasm with what's been brought forward so far, but I'd like to see the priority put on getting the condo side out of things particularly. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was exactly 5 minutes. I'm not sure if staff would like to respond. Perhaps Mr. Fleming, if we could ask you to consider those comments and your thoughts.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a couple of answers to some of the questions around contributions to the reserve fund. So the way that the program prior to our service review worked was a developer would come forward with an application for a building permit, and the city would pay for the development charges relating to that application. And that meant that our folks in finance would have to essentially put a lot of money into the reserve fund, not knowing what applications might come forward. So to deal with the risk of not having enough money in the reserve fund, there were substantial contributions being made, which were necessary in some cases. So the program was changed to one where a developer now would come forward, would pay the development charges, and then would be rebated a portion of those development charges back every year for 10 years. And in doing so, that would allow us to understand up front what the requirement was by way of contributions to the reserve fund and how that could be managed over time. So what that did was initially, when we did the service review on our incentive programs, was saved in the order of $600,000 per year as contributions to the reserve fund. Now that we had that clarity around what needed to be contributed. And then more recently, Finance brought forward in a report that looked at all of our reserve funds, an additional $200,000 reduction, $500,000 reduction to contributions to that reserve fund. So that's where those two amounts are coming from, and it essentially comes from a different approach that was established through the service review, which freed up a significant amount of money, reduced the amount that we need to contribute to those reserve funds every year. On the metrics, I just want to make clear that we have one of the most advanced and comprehensive reviews of metrics relating to regeneration of our downtown through the State of the Downtown report in the province. We have a lot of measures relating to, for each of the programs, what kind of leverage they have. So for every dollar that council puts forward in the way of an incentive, how many dollars that leverages in terms of development, direct development in the downtown. What our report today refers to is understanding with a little bit more detail our measures of success. So not just metrics and understanding what leverage we're getting out, but setting targets for what represents a revitalized or regenerated downtown. And so that's what you'll see on page 7 and 8 of the report. It's a process that we're going through, and we're expecting by the second quarter of next year that will be completed. And we'll then be able to establish some sunset targets. They will not be dates, but they'll be tied to specific measures of success. And at that time, where those targets are met, we would be able to establish, or council would, whether they would like to move those same dollars to other parts of the city or discontinue the program and put those dollars towards the tax levy.
Thank you. Any comments or questions for Mr. Fleming from colleagues? Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thanks, Mr. Fleming and Mr. Butler, for your comments on this. DC rebate programs have been one that I think we've talked about quite a bit over the years, and still working towards refinements on it. The remaining question out of all of this, I think we've made some really good steps in terms of having the development charges paid up front and then rebated over 10 years allows us much more stability in budgeting. The remaining question is what's the right amount of rebate for each of these projects, and it's identified in here about whether we move from 100% to 80% or 50%, whatever it is in there. I think that's the next step in all of this, is to figure out does touching that amount impact the amount of development or investment that might happen in these classes, either in industrial or residential, and that's hard to know. I think that's but when you're looking at DCs, sometimes in the order of $3 million, a 20% change is a $600,000 impact on our budget. Now that's over 10 years, so before it used to be in a given year, but it's still an impact on taxpayers and our finances. So it sounds like the approach here is prudent. I was hoping that maybe we'd be able to find some good opportunities for savings in this. I do recognize that a couple of those changes are fairly recent, and we do want to see what the impact of those is. I think it's really hard to untie all of the factors that that are involved with whether development occurs in the core or not, or whether whether development occurs in industrial areas or not. A lot of it's economy, a lot of it's collateral investments that are occurring at the same time. It's market confidence. It's the investments that we're making as a city in those areas as well. What is the one factor? Are DCs the factor that are actually getting people to build or not? And I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think we know the answer to that. And it sounds like that's kind of our next step in this journey. So I look forward to seeing that, and I hope that we can get through that somewhat quickly so that we can right-size our DC rebates.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions for Mr. Fleming or other staff? Seeing none, colleagues, we have in front of us a recommendation that the report from our planning city planner be received, as well as the commentary delegation from Mr. Butler. I'll look for a mover, please. Deputy Mayor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Hillier. I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 14-0.
Colleagues, I'm going to beg your indulgence for just a moment before we get into the scheduled items. We have a guest who may have some time constraints I've just found out, and we're trying to see what we can do to accommodate. So just bear with us another moment. Talk amongst yourselves, and we'll be back to you shortly. And enjoy the chocolates. Our guest, who we'd requested delegation status from Middlesex County, is not here right now, but it's a bit early, but I understand there may be some time constraints as a result of that. We will move to the regularly scheduled items 3.1, which is tabling of the 2023 multi-year budget and I'd like to turn the floor over to Chair of the Budget Finance Committee and Budget, Councillor Morgan.
Yeah, but it looks like it's many volumes.
Okay, I hope everybody's got the budget. We'll give you a few minutes to read the whole thing. I'm just kidding. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a presentation from our treasurer. It's about a 30-minute overview of the budget, and then we'll go into technical questions. And after the technical questions are complete, there will be a short recess so the media has an opportunity to ask some questions about the budget. So that's the process we're going to follow, but we'll start off with a presentation from our treasurer. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. So I am pleased to present to you the Sac City's second multi-year budget for the years 2020 to 2023. So I think before I start, the very most important part, I think, is a huge thank you to all of the assistance and cooperation that we received from all of the various areas to put this budget together. This has been an exceptionally challenging year with a lot of things outside of our particular control. So to pull this together was a little bit more challenging than I think we had envisioned in May when we first came before you. So I want to give a very special thanks to all my finance staff who, under Kyle Murray's leadership, has pulled all this document together in its form before you today, and who have also participated in a very large number of budget engagement events, even before the budget is tabled. I also want to give a huge round of thank you to the senior leadership team for their guidance and leadership in the development of this budget, corporate communications, all of the various service areas, the agencies, boards, and commissions who have worked hard to contribute to the document that you have before you today. So our staff have handed out 3 documents. So the tax-supported SURLOCs is the primary document. It contains a summary of all of the tax-supported budget. All of the detailed business cases are in a separate document entitled Business Cases, and we have a third document that shows the water and wastewater treatment budgets that are also tabled here today. So just to give you a really brief agenda in terms of where we're going to go, I'm going to walk you through the multi-year budget process and give you a refresher on the targets and the provincial impacts of where we were. I'm going to then show you how that compares to the tabled budget that you have before you, and walk through the detailed decision points of how we're going to walk you through the budget deliberations in January and February. And we have some budget impacts, and then really linking to tax policy so that you can see the holistic approach, and laying out a couple of our key financial principles. And then I'm going to turn it over to Kyle, who's going to give a bit of an overview in terms of the details contained, as well as go over the key dates in our upcoming budget engagement. And at the very end, we're going to turn it over to our budget chair, who has a couple administrative matters at the very beginning to go through. So turning through our multi-year budget, this diagram just gives you, in a nutshell, is a picture of the process that, of course, through the multi-year budget we've undertaken. The foundation of this is, of course, Council's strategic plan, which was approved earlier this year. So that sets the guidance in terms of what is going to be, what was forwarded to the budget. And earlier this year in May, we had the target setting process, which was also the critical piece to go forward, noting that whatever is approved through the multi-year budget is ratified each and every year through an annual update process. So just to walk you through where we started. So in May, we came forward and we estimated that approximately 2.2% was to maintain our existing service levels. And we had identified that approximately 0.5% would be set aside to give additional funding for council's priorities that might come forward through the strategic plan. No sooner had we tabled that report where we were advised of the provincial changes that came forward, and the 2.2 was approximately the same. However, what ended up happening was that some of that provincial downloading that was anticipated does cut into what we were anticipating. We would have some capacity to be able to support council strategic plan through that 0.5, which brought it down to 0.2 that was estimated over the life of the multi-year budget to be able to move forward. So when you take that and start to look at how that compares to what we have tabled for you today, you'll see on the left-hand side column was where we were last at, and on the right-hand side is the summary of where we're at in terms of the budget documents that is contained within the documents we gave to you. So what you will see is the 2.2 is roughly the same. It's actually at 2.3 within the documents we've provided. 0.4% is specifically with respect to land ambulance, and this is all an average over the course of the 4 years. And 0.5 is specific to the provincial downloading impacts. And if all of the business cases were approved through, that have been submitted to the multi-year budget, it's approximately 1.3% on average over the 4 years, which would give a 4.5% total. So just to show you, based on that and knowing the constraints that certainly that would be a challenge for the taxpayer, Civic Administration tried to look at critically across all of the business cases that had been there and tried to prioritize a number of them to show you what can be done within 0.6 that is very similar to the original 0.5 that we had presented originally in our targets. So as part of that, this gives you a 3.8% average compared to the 2.7 over the course of the multi-year budget. What that looks like over the 4 years, I'll just walk you through quickly. So you can see this 2.3% on average is the base budget excluding land ambulance and provincial impacts. So you can see how it varies over the course of the 4 years. When you layer on the land ambulance, you can see how the average over the 4 years raises to 2.7%, noting that it's most significant in 2020. And then when you layer on top the provincial impacts, again, mostly in 2020, you'll see that we're at a 3.2% average. And then layering on top just the administratively prioritized additional investment business cases, you come to a 3.8% average. So you can get a bit of a picture in terms of what that potentially could mean over the 4-year budget that we will be debating over the next 2 months. So how we're going to walk you through is what we've spent a lot of time, and this next slide walks you through the process, and this is all laid out in your budget document on page 34. So what we've done is we've identified a number of decision points to take you step by step through all of the decisions that will guide you through the budget deliberations process. So the very first decision is the base budget. So this is all of the service areas, including agencies, boards, and commissions, excluding land ambulance and the provincial impacts, at 2.3%. The next decision point will be specifically looking at land ambulance because it is quite significant. We've broken that out as a separate decision item. And then the last thing within our base budget is the provincial impacts. And what we've done is categorize them into 2 buckets, for lack of a better term. The first bucket is specifically what you're mandated to pay, as in cost sharing. You need to put in more money to be able to receive the same level of funding you're currently receiving today. And the for consideration is everything else where there is, albeit a very challenging decision point, there is a service level discussion with respect to the service levels that are funded with stepping into the province's shoes to retain that same amount of funding that will then be borne by the city. The next step specifically is then looking at the reductions, and I'll speak more about this in a moment. And that'll be a very specific line item that we'll be able to walk you through specifically. And then the additional investments. So what we've done to try to guide council through is we took all of the additional investments, and we essentially, for lack of a better term, drew a line at 0.6% and said, here's the things that if you want to stay within that, you can do above it, and here's the remainder below. It is simply to guide council to assist you in walking through those decision points. You can choose either way, which way you'd like to go, and this will then at the end of the day add up to the entire, if everything was absolutely approved as presented, it would be 4.5%. So one of the things that I really want to focus on is that because of the challenges, civic administration spent a lot of time up front trying to find and examine every single line item to put as much reduction as part of the initial tabling as we could without impacting service levels. So this was something that 0.7% has already been included as a reduction included in the base budgets that are presented. And this was trying to be as fiscally responsible as possible to try to mitigate the impacts that we knew were coming forward and to make the budget very, very challenging. So a number of these, they may potentially impact some of our flexibility, but because they did not impact service, we felt that it was prudent to take them up front and give those savings back to the taxpayer as early on as possible. So that 0.7% represents $4.3 million on average annual savings each year. So if we hadn't included that, the base budget and all things including the land ambulance and provincial impacts would have been tabled at 3.9 rather than the 3.2 you see in front of you. So on November the 12th, Council, when we brought back our early update, when we were starting to identify the challenges, Council resolved that civic administration was to go back and develop business cases for potential reductions, as well as engage with the agency boards and commissions that were in excess of target to look for potential opportunities. So that is exactly what we've done and we're bringing forward. Those will be coming forward at the January 7th SPPC meeting, and they will then be incorporated as part of the budget process as that separate decision point that we had identified early on. The next decision point being the additional investments. What we've done is there are 25 additional investment business cases. Many of them have multiple component parts so that you can go through item by item and you can mix and match and slice and dice whatever way is there. But what we've done is we've tried to separate them into two buckets, noting that based on council's priorities, there were some things that were highly valued and important that we tried to recognize. And if it's easier to say above the line or below the line, that's basically what we've tried to do, is to really give you some guidance. You can absolutely approve all of them. You could approve none of them. You can move between all of them, depending on what makes sense. And during your review of the business cases, this was simply a way to assist you in moving through the process. So just to give you a sense in terms of where we're at, through the various components, so when you look at the base budget and the provincial impacts, this is the average taxpayer impact. At the 3.2%, that represents $94 additional cost for the taxpayer over the multi-year budget. If you were to look at maintaining the existing service levels and include just the 0.6 that civic administration has helped to prioritize, that would result in the 3.8% or $113 on average for the average taxpayer. And if council were to approve everything, all of the additional business cases, that would result in $135 to the average residential taxpayer over the 4 years. So how does that relate to where we are at in terms of other municipalities? So BMA publishes a study every year, and they look at how we compare with populations greater than 100,000. So what you'll see from a residential perspective on relative taxes, we're third from the bottom, so quite below the average. When you look at the commercial, again, you'll see we're third from the bottom and well below the average. And with respect to industrial, we're still also third from the average, although you can see there's much more narrow range between the top and the bottom. So taking all of that in terms of what does that mean to the taxpayer and with respect to the bill that they pay. So I think this is something that we've talked about in a number of conversations. So with respect to tax policy, there's one portion that is controllable by council. Obviously, the budget increase and how much it needs to raise, and then the actual council-approved tax policy. But also, with respect to setting the tax policy, is a bunch of uncontrollable pieces. The education taxes that get added onto the municipal taxes, those are set by the province annually. The assessed value of each property is determined by MPAC, who's independent, and that gets reassessed every 4 years. And then any other provincial legislative changes that could occur. So when you look at all of this, basically based on the assessed value that MPAC will show, depending on whether you're above or below the average, your tax increases will also be above or below the average accordingly. So the one thing that I will note is that the tax policy is set after the budget approval. So right now, what you're doing is determining how much the budget needs are for the municipality to deliver the services. So if we look at that in terms of an illustration, I always like to use the pie analogy. So the budget is determining how big that pie is and how much money you need to raise. So if the pie, if you need more money to support a larger base for your service delivery, the pie gets a little bit bigger. However, the tax policy that is set determines how the increase in the property taxes is then funded by the residential, commercial, multi-residential, industrial components. So that determines ultimately how big a piece of the tax pie that they are going to pay ultimately. So to take it one step further, in terms of using last year's multi-year budget, or our last 4 years multi-year budget, over the course of the multi-year budget, the average tax-supported budget increase was 2.7%. When you look at the actual average residential payment in the various categories after the education taxes, for the average residential payment taxpayer, their increases were on average 1.5% over that same time period. So this is the bill that they actually pay. So really what this gives you a sense of is that the budget is really one part of the bigger process in terms of what tax impact is going to be on a particular property in any given year. So the other key piece that we really want to review is the key financial principles, and a lot of these are contained within your document. On page 22, and I think it's important to go through them. So one of the things we ask you to take into account over your deliberations in the next 2 months is look at the tax levy on a long-term basis over the 4 years rather than focusing on one given year at a time. Try to avoid the pressure of filling in for services and programs that have been discontinued by other levels of government. Do try to use one-time money specifically for one-time costs, because the nature of being one-time means they don't recur. And specifically, look at revenue sources that cover expenditures that are specific so that if the revenue disappears, so does the expense that goes along with it. When you look at the new initiatives, particularly contained within our business cases, consider the entire, all of the operating costs as well as the capital and the benefits that will also be given to the community as a result of those initiatives. Avoid taking on new services without fully looking at the long-term view and potential exits. And try to make decisions in line with the City of London's capital priorities. If federal, provincial funding do not align with those priorities, or if the city doesn't have the capacity to pay, then you may choose to make a different decision, even though that there's money on the table that you may leave behind. And I think first and foremost, we've always talked about reserves and reserve funds. Try to keep them at an adequate level. Those are there to fund our long-term initiatives and have served us well to mitigate swings to the taxpayer over a period of time. And if you do use them, try to ensure that if it's strategic, that if you do bring a draw in, that by the end of the 4-year budget, it is removed so that you're not pushing those problems down the road over to the next multi-year budget process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kyle Murray, who's going to give you a brief overview of the budget documents that are in front of you.
Okay, so Annalisa has already walked you through the decision points at a high level, but I'll give you a little more information or details around each of them. So decision point 1A is the base budget, excluding land ambulance and provincial impacts. This is highlighted on page 36 of your budget surlocks. This chart on the screen breaks down the increases by service. And I'll point out kind of the more significant ones that are worth noting. First and foremost being economic prosperity. This is a 4.5% average annual decrease. This reduction is due to the planned reduction in the contribution to the Economic Development Reserve Fund. This was reported to you back on October 28th in the Service Review of Reserve Funds report. Second one worth noting is the environmental services area. This is a 4% average annual increase, primarily due to private sector labor costs, maintenance and service costs for vehicles and equipment, and additional resource requirements at our material recovery facility in order to meet end market specifications for our recycled goods. Financial management is a 4.1% average annual increase. This is where we fund our capital plan. So this is our capital levy, our debt servicing costs, our reserve fund contributions, as well as our corporate contingency budgets. Decision point 1B, as Annalisa mentioned, due to the significance, we've broken it out separately. It is a 15.8% average annual increase for the land ambulance service. This represents approximately 0.4% on average to the city's tax levy. Decision point 2A is the recommended provincial impacts. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on them. You can find them on pages 37 and 38 of your budget surlocks. Essentially, they represent approximately an average of about 0.1% over the 4 years. Decision point 2B, these are the provincial impacts that we've presented for your consideration. Again, on pages 38 and 39 of your budget surlocks. These provincial impacts total $9.8 million by 2023, which represents an average annual tax levy increase of approximately 0.4%. The most significant item here is obviously the one that you see reflected in the Transportation Service Program, and that relates to the cancellation of the planned doubling of the provincial gas tax that LTC relies on for their operating budget. Just giving you a brief overview of our capital budget. Further information can be found on page 43, but over the 4 years, our capital budget is approximately $1.1 billion and approximately a little shy of $2.5 billion over the 10-year capital plan. Breaking it down by year, it's fairly smooth, but there are a couple of years where you see a spike, and those larger capital plans in 2023 and 2025 are due to a couple more significant factors. The first being funding for new multipurpose recreation centers in the Northwest and the Southeast. Those are in 2023, as well as a number of significant transportation projects, most notably the rapid transit projects, as well as the couple of large Sunningdale Road widening projects. This slide I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but just wanted to highlight that the left side of the screen highlights how our tax-supported capital budget is financed, and the right side shows how our non-tax supported capital budget is financed. Key point there, I guess, is that it's roughly a 50-50 split on the 2020 to 2029 capital plan. A few debt highlights. So this graph that you see in front of you has two components. The bar chart reflects the amount of debt that we have outstanding, and the line graph reflects our annual debt servicing costs. So the key point here that I really want to drive home is that compared to 2016, our 10-year average capital plan, our tax-supported capital plan, has increased approximately 30%. However, if you look at our 2020 to 2025 debt levels, it's approximately equivalent to the amount of debt we had last year. So I think this really illustrates our prudent use of debt and our prudent debt management practices, that we're able to keep our debt under control. So how do we do that? There are a number of strategies we use. We continue to try to avoid the use of debt for life cycle renewal capital projects. So we are working towards 0% debt in our life cycle renewal capital plan by 2022. This budget puts us on track to accomplish that. We continue to employ an internal debt cap. We have a number of policies that allow us to limit or reduce the amount of debt that we have authorized, most notably the surplus deficit policy, as well as our assessment growth policy. Through the last multi-year budget, we were able to avoid issuing $5 million of debt through these policies that we have in place. We continue to have a target for debt servicing costs as a percentage of our revenues, and we are comfortably below that in this budget. And of course, we continue to strive towards maintaining our AAA credit rating, which is now 43 consecutive years. Just a couple of points I want to make on reserves and reserve funds. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, our tax-supported capital plan has increased significantly in this cycle, approximately 30% compared to the 2016 multi-year budget. However, our tax-supported contributions to our reserve funds have only marginally increased. So I think what that says is that we're doing a good job of effectively utilizing our reserve funds, taking a good hard look at what our needs are, and planning accordingly with the use of our reserve funds. We continue to, as I mentioned, prioritize the use of reserve funds and capital levy for life cycle renewal projects rather than debt. And as you can see, we are kind of right in our target range, the middle of our target range for the percentage of the budget, the life cycle renewal budget that we want to see financed through reserve funds. Additional investments. So Annalisa has spoken to these already as well. We've categorized them as administratively prioritized or for consideration. These are the tax levy impacts by year. This slide breaks down those business cases that we have categorized as administratively prioritized. The key point, I'm not going to go through all of these, you can refer to your business case SIRLOCs. The key point I want to make though is that they're simply listed in alphabetical order. There is no prioritization amongst them or no additional meaning to the numbering. It's strictly an alphabetical ordering of those business cases. Similarly, on the for consideration business cases, these have also been presented in alphabetical order. Just very briefly on water and wastewater as well. As you know, Council has approved a 2.5% rate increase for both water and wastewater for 2020. That is the forecasted rate increase for 2021 through 2023 as well. The one thing worth pointing out is that although rates are only going up 2.5%, the actual water budget is going up an average of 4.1% per year. And that's a reflection of the projected increase in consumption that we're forecasting for the upcoming 4 years. On the water capital budget, the 4-year budget represents approximately $200 million, and the 10-year capital plan is a little shy of $500 million. Broken down by year, the major year in the water capital plan is 2023, and this is primarily due to a project that replaces and expands the Springbank Reservoir number 2. On the wastewater side, again, similar story. The rate increase is projected to be 2.5% for the upcoming 4-year cycle. The wastewater budget is going up an average of 3.9%, again, due to the effect of the increased consumption. On the wastewater capital budget, the 4-year budget is approximately $365 million and approximately a little over $900 million for the 10-year capital plan. The major year for wastewater is 2025 due to 3 primary projects. The city center servicing strategy, phase 8, a significant project on Clark Road from Oxford to Huron, as well as the Pottersburg Trunk Sewer phase 3 project. So switching gears, I just wanted to talk a little bit about key dates in the budget process, as well as how we're intending to engage the public throughout this process. So obviously we're tabling today. The next key date in the process will be the January 7th SPPC, where you will receive a report that includes the business cases that you requested for potential net levy reductions. And also on that agenda will be a report on public engagement feedback that we've received up to and including December 2nd. The public participation meeting is scheduled for January 23rd, and then we get into budget deliberations starting on January 30th. We have 6 budget deliberation days scheduled, ultimately working towards final approval of the budget on March 2nd. In terms of public engagement, we're going to continue our active use of social media throughout this process. Tomorrow, we're looking to launch our business case survey on getinvolved.london.ca. This will be an opportunity for residents to review the business cases, both the additional investment cases as well as the potential reduction cases, and provide their input on all of those cases. We have 2 budget open house sessions scheduled, one on January the 11th and the other on January 15th, both at Goodwill Industries on Horton Street. And as of right now, we also have 2 community meetings scheduled as well. I mentioned the public participation meeting as well on January 23rd. And we're also always willing to come out and attend ward meetings at your request. If you are interested in that, we're certainly happy to attend and give a presentation or a Q&A on the budget process. So I'm going to pass it over to the budget chair, who'd like to say a couple things from an administrative perspective.
Thank you for that. So through the course of the last multi-year budget and then discussions with our staff on this budget process, I wanted to forward a couple of suggestions for my colleagues that will help smooth the budget process along. I certainly know where we've had some challenges on the staff side in pulling together information on short notice, as well as delays in the decision-making of the meetings. And so I've outlined just a couple of points that I hope colleagues can consider as we go through the coming months of budget process. The first is, as you read through your budget documents, you're going to have lots of questions on the different service areas. And the managing directors of all the service areas are available to answer questions regarding the multi-year budget if you have questions about the implementation of those. Should you be looking to make changes or ask questions about that, any heads up that you can give them to ensure that we have the right staff members at the right budget meetings would be really helpful as we progress through the budget. And when you see the way the budget debate is laid out, you'll be able to anticipate when we're approaching different service areas. But if you could get your questions into staff beforehand so we can make sure that they bring all the answers as much as you possibly can. I realize some things will happen on the fly. That will be helpful. If you're planning any amendments too, any ability to circulate those in advance, I know Councillor Squire isn't here, but I'm sure he'd be nodding, is obviously helpful for a couple of reasons. One, amendments are going to have impact on the levy. You're probably going to want to know those impacts. Staff will be able to model those into the spreadsheet and the system that they're using, so that as we consider your amendments, we'll be able to show the impacts to all of council on how that would change the budget context. If you're planning to declare a conflict, and a number of colleagues declared a conflict today, so I would encourage those colleagues to work with our staff and the city clerk to ensure that we fully understand the scope of your conflicts so that we can ensure you can vote on as much of the budget as possible. As I'm sure you could tell, pulling a specific type of item out of all of the different components of the operating and capital budget does take a little bit of work. We prefer not to do that on the fly during the budget process. So anybody who has declared a conflict or feels that they may declare a conflict and knows it in advance, if you work with our staff, we will make sure that we outline a series of decisions that will allow you to vote on as much of the budget as possible while insulating you from the conflicts you have and allowing you to declare on those. And in support of this, our finance staff are going to schedule sessions in January for councillors who may have questions about the budget, may want support in developing motions or changes to the budget, and that'll be made available to you if you'd like to have that support to ensure that as we progress through the actual debate of the budget, we're well prepared, we have the right staff in the room, and we have the right modeling in the finance models to actually show the impacts of the changes you want to make. Again, I say all that knowing that things will come up on the fly, but as much as possible, if we can stick to this, we'll actually have a much smoother budget process. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. First, if I can, I'd like to thank our staff and acknowledge the tremendous efforts that obviously have been put into the multi-year budget by Ms. Barbone and everyone associated with this. I think it's a huge effort. I appreciate the budget was compounded by certain challenges associated with several outside forces beyond council's control. So here's the thing, I really truly look forward to the future meetings as we delve into the details of this report. However, today, we are looking to receive this report, and I'm prepared to so move the tabling of the documents associated with the multi-year budget.
Okay, so the mayor wants to put the receipt of the multi-year budget on the floor. Seconder, Councillor Lehman. So at this point, we certainly have the opportunity to ask our staff any technical questions you have on the budget presentation. As you can see in the outline of the budget process, we have lots and lots of dates where we can debate all the details of the budget. I know you've just received it today, but that being said, you may have a number of technical questions based on the presentation. We'd like to address those today before we break for the media scrum. So I'd open it up to colleagues who have questions on the presentation. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to our staff. First of all, thank you for the tremendous amount of work that goes into this. I know it's not an easy task, and you're getting input from all directions all the time. With regard to the public engagement piece, I certainly want to have as much public engagement as possible. But I wonder why we're launching a public engagement piece on December 18th when we aren't getting the business cases for potential reductions until January 7th, because based on my experience with public engagement, it's hard enough to get them to engage once, let alone twice. And so we're only asking them to engage on half the picture rather than the whole picture. So why are we launching a public engagement piece before we have the full options before the public?
Ms. Barbon.
Thank you, through the chair. So although the meeting is not until January 7th, the agenda is actually public tomorrow, and all those cases will be available tomorrow. So that is exactly why we've timed the launch of the survey to coincide with the information being available publicly.
Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. Through the chair, obviously a lot to go through, and I appreciate the high-level overview. In terms of the decision points and how they've been structured, perhaps you could walk me through how you make decisions around, for example, what to recommend and what to have for council's consideration when you're dealing with things like provincial impacts in different services and boards and commissions and so forth.
Ms. Barbon.
Thank you, through the chair. So really what we tried to do is to pull together, and I think early on when we had identified with all of the all of the summary of the changes for provincial impacts that had come forward, we had identified that there's some that council doesn't have a choice. So we're cost sharing, and it says thou shalt now pay 60% versus 50%. That is an automatic impact that you can't, you need to legislatively abide by. Whereas something like the provincial gas tax not doubling, where that has been included in the for consideration column means that it's not a mandate. You do have a choice, although it's not a great choice, I might add. We've separated the two between what you absolutely have no authority to say no to versus one that you actually could impact service levels to try to abide by. So it was trying to give some decision points, because there are some that are smaller impacts that you might actually, some areas might say, well, see if you can absorb that or try to do something. The provincial gas tax is certainly one that is the most significant of that. So we wanted to be able to make sure that council had the ability to go through and make a decision on what service level it wishes to fund going forward. So that was how we came between the two columns with respect to that.
And when we get into the discussions around the different boards and commissions, as you know very well, through the chair, they're quite different. You know, the conservation authorities can levy. The health unit is quite different from some of the others. The police board, as we know, is a bit different. Are you going to give a presentation specifically about those things? Because there's things that are not mandated you have to pay, but there's some that are very close, and just glancing at it, doesn't look like some of them are recommended. So I just want to make sure that we're fully aware of that, and that when we have the presentation and discussion and debate, that we're going to be addressing that as we're getting into the debates in those areas.
Ms. Barbon.
Through the chair, we can certainly go through that. I think earlier this year, we did, as part of the service review where we had the discussion, we did have the listing of all the boards and commissions and where we have authority and discretion. I think Mr. Card had helped us with some of that earlier this year, so we can bring that forward again. So you have that information. And I think really, you know, ultimately it's a discussion about service levels. And I think from our perspective, when we look at some of the decision points, we have focused on maintaining existing service levels, which is the 3.2, which is really everything that's there. And I think really when we looked at that, it was a bit of a challenge to say, well, how do we put everything in the column that's recommended? Because there's still a choice that council could have. In theory, you could actually put everything related to provincial downloading in that for consideration column. It's a really fine line between some of that because you could in theory reduce your service so that you could mitigate that without increasing the budget. It's an ugly thing to do, but there are ways to get around it. So I think we're really just trying to be able to show what everything is and put that out there. But I think from a truly, if you were trying to support your maintain existing service levels and not have any reductions, the 3.2 is ultimately what the cost of those services will be.
Other questions? Councillor Van Meerbergen.
There used to be, at budget tabling time, a very thick binder that came with these smaller ones. It was about, I don't know, Martin, you probably remember, they were like 4 inches thick or something. So you could really get into the weeds into each department. Will that be available to us, or can we find something similar online?
Ms. Barbon.
Through the chair, yes, that is absolutely all of that information, including the line by all of the details of the service areas and everything that used to be in that binder will be available online and will be put up as soon as this meeting is concluded.
And you'll let us know where and how we can activate it or get into it?
We can certainly send out a link to all the councillors. Everything is contained on one landing page with respect to the budget, so it will have all of the information that we've presented today with the summary versions, and the detail will be available below it, and we can certainly provide those links through the clerk, so it'll be easy access for all of you.
Further questions? Okay, seeing none, I just wanted to make a brief comment. First off, I wanted to echo what the mayor said, thanking our staff. I've had the ability to work with Ms. Barbon and her team over the past months to get us to this point. I certainly appreciate the amount of care and thought that they put into the budget so far, particularly the measures that were already taken to reduce the budget. I know in the last multi-year budget, we took upon ourselves to provide some direction to go find some savings. As you can see, our staff have already done the work to find about that much savings at the front end of the budget and incorporate in about a 0.7 or $4.3 million reduction even into the base budget. And I know our service review process will continue through the years to come. So thank you very much for taking the council direction and doing that work. I would also say that this budget, I think, has been laid out well from a decision point standpoint. There's a number of complicated factors that relate into our budget. There's a number of pressures from different either inflation or maintaining existing services or the province or land ambulance or our strategic plan. Structuring it in a way where we're able to tackle those decisions and be fairly transparent in where the decision points are. I appreciate the way that it's been laid out and structured, and I know that that's a little bit different than it's felt in the past. And as we move into the budget debate and discussion, I know that the budget will be laid out in a way that will hopefully make for some fairly clear moving through the budget process that I hope colleagues will appreciate. But certainly as we go through the process, we can make improvements as we flow through it. So so thank you again to our staff for the work that they've done today. I know this is kind of, a lot of work has gone into this point, but there's obviously a lot of work ahead. So, you know, I look forward to that work ahead with our colleagues. So if there's no other discussion, the receipt of the table budget has been moved and seconded. If that's the case, I'm going to put that on the floor and then hand the chair back over to the mayor so that I can vote. And I'll make my motion.
Counselor Van Holst. Closing the vote, the motion's passed 14-0.
Thank you, and thank you, Councillor Morgan, for your work in chairing this process, and the work's not yet done, but we appreciate the work done thus far. I believe you have a motion you'd like to present.
Yes, Your Worship. I circulated a motion. I have a seconder for it related to the public participation meetings. I would like to put that on the floor, and then I'd like to provide some context on why I'm forwarding that, but perhaps I could put it on the floor and then provide some rationale. So I'll read the motion. That the city clerk be directed to make the necessary arrangements to schedule a second public participation meeting at a Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee meeting to be held Thursday, February 13th, 2020, commencing at 6 p.m. to receive further public input regarding the 2020 to 2023 multi-year budget.
Moved by Councillor Morgan, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer. Any comments or questions with respect to the motion on the floor?
Well, if I could provide some rationale.
Absolutely.
So in the last multi-year budget, we actually did this. We had 2 public participation meetings, and it's for the same reasons that I suggest we do the same. If we look at where our public participation meeting lies, and if you look at page 31 in your handout, you'll see that we have a public participation meeting, and then we have 6 dates of debate on the multi-year budget where we'll be making a great number of decisions on that budget. It doesn't give us much of an opportunity to have the public check back in with council formally through a public participation process at all. And so last time, this was a helpful process near the end of those debate sessions to get a check-in from members of the public who want to engage with council directly to ensure that we can do that. The reason why I suggested an evening is last time we found that was when most people could come. I suggested the 13th because it does give us one final day of budget deliberations that if there are comments that we want to take action on from the public, we would have an opportunity at committee to do that rather than have to do that at council on the 2nd, which would be always a little bit of an awkward thing to do in the formal council process. So that's my rationale for bringing it forward. It's what we did last time. There's a request from the Urban League to actually do this again. They thought it was quite helpful. So I'm happy to put this on the floor for our consideration. And the date and time I chose was simply through consultation with our staff and what worked last time.
Duly moved and seconded. Any other comments with respect to the motion? Councillor Turner.
I think I'm very supportive of this. I recall several years ago there was a budget process where all the PPMs had finished, and then there were significant changes to the budget after the PPMs were all done. I think if there was any changes or movement afoot beyond the PPM dates, I think it's really important that we do have that opportunity to check back. I thank the councillor for the opportunity for him to have put that forward.
Thank you. Any other comments? Seeing none, I'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 14-0.
Colleagues, it's apparently customary that at a stage like this that there is a media scrum, and I know that we've been asked to participate in that, and I would look for a motion to have a brief recess for 15 minutes as we do that. Moved by Councillor Morgan, seconded by Councillor Lewis. Comments or questions? I'll turn your attention to the screen as we will.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 14-0.
Colleagues, will resume at 5:30. This meeting is recessed until then. Thank you, colleagues. I'd like to put us back in session if we could, please. The final scheduled item that we have is with respect to the land ambulance draft budget update that we are going to receive from Mr. Bill Rayburn, our CAO of Middlesex County and Chair of the Middlesex London Emergency Services Authority. But as I do, please note that we'd also like to welcome Warden Kathy Burkhart-Jessen to the Horseshoe in a bit, and we're delighted that you're here today. So, Ms. Burkhart-Jessen, as your father was very familiar with these environs very well, it's delightful to have you here as well. And certainly, I see Neil Roberts in the crowd here, part of certainly the leadership of the EMS, and we're delighted to have you here, sir. So with that, I wonder if I could turn this to you, Mr. Rayburn, as you make your presentation to council.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm glad to be here and to answer any questions. I understand the questions will be at the end, so I'll try to quickly move through and follow the chair's guide. I just wanted to give you a bit of an update, and here's what I wanted to talk about today. Give you some background on how the service is funded and how it works, talk a little bit about our current and future challenges, financial implications of those challenges, where I really would like to focus. I'm not sure it's going to be possible, but I'd really like to spend most of our time talking about opportunities to work together on how we address some of these issues, and then some next steps. So just in terms of some background, the service was transferred from the province in 1998, and that was also at the same time the social housing was provided to the City of London as a consolidated municipal service manager, childcare, Ontario Works, and we became responsible for land ambulance. And we really took an interesting approach to how we delivered it. It wasn't necessarily the same approach that happened in other communities, but we delivered this service from the day one with no boundaries. We didn't think about the City of London. We didn't think about the County of Middlesex. We thought about the Middlesex-London area whenever we did our boundary and service delivery models. And we have a long service history with this service now because we have utilized both private consultants private contractors to deliver the service, and we've done it in-house. So we have several different examples of how this service can work. And we have an interesting governance structure because we have an authority that's in place that is separate and apart from our regular governance. And the MOC model means that the governance is provided by the CMSM model means that governance is provided by the County of Middlesex, and there are funders. And as I mentioned earlier, there are similar situations for social housing in reverse and for Ontario Works. From day one, we tried to do some unprecedented and innovative, unique accommodations that have been the model, I think, for how to provide information and how to do this type of service across the province. We developed something that is called the Management Oversight Committee. Why did we do that? We did it because we were a smaller by population municipality delivering to a much larger, we call the elephant-sized municipality. And we wanted to make sure that we were giving good information and also getting good information. This Management Oversight Committee was made up of the base hospital medical director. There were 3 city representatives and a county representative, which was myself. And what we did was we sat around a table, and almost all the decisions that were made administratively were moved through this group. And we would make recommendations together as a group. But it was a fantastic opportunity for us to learn about what challenges there were from a service delivery perspective in the city, and also for the city representatives to gain a better understanding of what our decision-making process was and why we were making certain decisions. So that was a unique accommodation that we made on day one, and we've made some other ones. We can talk later about our 24/7 station decision, setting up a separate authority, making sure we had no dedicated stations, meaning specific to a specific municipality, and we can talk about some of the service agreements that we've had. But there's been a lot of unique things that we've done together to try and make sure that we have an outstanding relationship. And I would argue with anyone that asked that we've had one of the best city-county relationships when it comes to CMSM arrangements, a very unique arrangement, but the best, I think, in the province, and there's many in the room that would agree with me. So going to agreements, we have had 2. Prior to 2013, everything was done by weighted assessment. In 2013 and 2017, we came to get together twice, and we changed the agreements to be cost allocated based upon weighted assessment and call volume ratio. Now, the reason that's important is because you can actually have a change in any one of these ratios that will have an impact upon what the cost is to one municipality or the other, even if the budget was to stay at zero in terms of an increase. There are three things you need to know what your individual municipal cost is going to be, and that is the provincial funding ratio, call volume ratio, and assessment ratio based upon those formulas. And two of those factors don't impact significantly, call volume ratio and assessment ratio, but certainly the provincial funding ratio has a significant impact upon the funders in terms of the cost of land ambulance. We've had a really long history of information provision. We're going to talk a little bit, hopefully, about my disappointment with the fact that the Management Oversight Committee no longer exists, and why I think it would be fantastic if we could get that going again, because we had regular, real-time exchange of information around the services we provide on your behalf to the citizens of London, and that was a tool that we really enjoyed and we thought was beneficial for both sides. Instead, now we're in a process where we meet with your finance team. That was done earlier in the year 2 times, and we also met with the city manager and treasurer to provide an update. And this is the same approach that we used during the last 4-year budget cycle. Budgeting concerns that I have around, I had a longer set of slides on this for our county council presentation on the same subject. Budgeting concerns that we worry about is that there's a number of significant factors we just don't have crystal balls for. As I mentioned, there's ratios around weighted assessment that are a factor in what it's going to cost you for land ambulance service. We have a reassessment coming up that will significantly change the assessment ratio, I expect, moving forward. We also aren't able to understand what the call volume ratio is until we get that information from the province, usually in February of the year, after the year is over. So there's several of the factors we need to determine what your costs are going to be ultimately that we just don't have a crystal ball for. And of particular note on that is we rarely know what the actual contribution is going to be from the province until March. And that is because it's not an agreed upon funding ratio with the province, it's a grant. And they can change it at any time. And in fact, in this year, they've even told us 3 different stories about what that will be next year. And only one of them in writing, and that was the first one, and the other 2 have been hypotheses about what will happen in March. So a lot of problems with not having a crystal ball for these significant factors. Our budget timetables are a little out of whack. That's another problem that we have. Maybe that's a Northern Ontario word, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure, but we're a little out of whack with our budget timetables. And the reason for that is our budget for land ambulance isn't really completed until March. And often the information that's to be provided is for the city is usually requested in October, September, sometime in that time frame. So what information you get is really an administrative guess at what the budget will be. As of now, there has not been a single governance eye that has seen the land ambulance budget. And that's a problem because I don't really like coming and talking about budgets that are administrative guesses. I like to talk about budgets that have at least seen a draft look, but yet I'm here today trying to answer your questions about where the budget might be headed. I think we had some challenges with the 4-year process, and I talked about those with our county council. We did our best to allow for to try and help with the 4-year process and give our best guesses, but there didn't necessarily work out the amount of flexibility considering the amount of change that happened in the land ambulance use. And so it wasn't significant. It was a very significant change in call volume that happened over the 4-year period, and there was also a number of significant pressures. And that didn't necessarily work well. It was our first time through the 4-year process. So we might be better next time, but that's some of our observations. I think as well, from an expectation point of view, there were some challenges as well because when we would talk about four-year budgets and what a four-year number might look like, we often felt that that was written in stone, or the feeling was it was written in stone. And from our perspective, these were simply estimates that had a lot of work to do to get towards final budgets because we budget annually, not on a four-year basis. I want to spend a little bit of time on this. We're looking at about a 15.9% increase as administrative estimate for next year. And we've had a significant growth in call volume, way off the charts from anything we had in our strategic plan, way off the charts from what we budgeted for the last 4 years. Offload delays is another one. Provincial funding uncertainty is at an all-time high. Presumptive legislation for post-traumatic stress disorder has had a significant impact upon our costs. Dispatch triage is another one. Overdue capital investments, and when I say capital investments, I'm not talking about facilities, I'm talking about the equipment we use day to day in the ambulance service. Cross-border usage and the costs associated with that is another budget pressure. And then sanctioned and unsanctioned events and the response that we need for those is another budget pressure. I'm going to focus in on call volume increases because I think that's one of the most dramatic. So far we've seen a 9.5% increase in call volume. We budgeted for 3.3. We're on track. We haven't even really had the impact of cold and flu season yet. This information around what's happening with our call volume, it gets tweeted out at the end of every week around what's happening with call volume, and it's very, very concerning, the rise in call volume that we're having across the entire Middlesex London area. But that's not just Middlesex London, it's also in other parts of the province as well. We budgeted for a 6.3% increase in call volumes next year, despite the fact that we have a 10.3%, we're tracking to 10.3. And we've had to make a number of investments in frontline resources, and in this upcoming administrative estimate, because we haven't really kept pace with call volume increases. If you look at our 4-year staffing over that 4-year period, I'd be glad to provide the chair a copy of a chart that we have that looks at the 4-year increase in staffing. And we have about a 15.7, it's coincidental, I promise you, we have a 15.7% gap between call volumes and increase in staffing. And one of the things that we've done is hit the wall in terms of staffing. There's only so much you can do. Councillor Turner will tell you that from a unit hour utilization perspective, ambulance is one of the highest in the emergency services world. And whenever you have a gap of 15.7% over a 4-year period in staffing compared to call volume ratio, you eventually hit the wall. You eventually have staffing issues that need to be addressed with an increase in frontline resources. And that is where the vast majority, the significant majority of, and I'll show you a chart of where the increases are going. They're going into frontline resources. Another challenge that we have that is significant, I just wanted to mention, this is a common picture. I think anybody that's been to the hospital has seen this many ambulances easily in offload delay. We've tried to do several initiatives to help address this, and I think all we're doing at this point is really sort of plugging a pretty big hole with our finger, but this is offload nurses is one thing we've tried in partnership with the province. Direct transfer is another thing that we're working with, and then emergency room restructuring is something that the hospital tried, but the offload delays just continue, and that's costing the service about $2 million a year in additional resource requirements. There's a number of systemic factors too. We can talk about them in as much detail as the chair requires, but triaging of dispatch calls is something that we should gain more understanding of. Population increase is something that's often overlooked. You say, well, what does it matter because you got call volume numbers, but we have to, a lot of London's growing at at the edges, and you're the 5th fastest growing census area in Canada, and we are our area is the 5th fastest growing, and we have to respond in advance of those calls with stations and resources that are out there in these periphery areas, and that has had an impact upon our costs as well. Certainly a shift in demographics, the aging population has impacted upon call volumes, and then we're also seeing a pretty substantial growth in the number of mental health and substance abuse calls, which I think would be familiar to members around the table. Certainly, we have a number of operational challenges, special events. I think you have seen some budget numbers about that. Delayed capital purchases, we're often asked by finance staff here and even sometimes by by members of council, why can't you push off capital purchases? Well, we have. And there comes a time where you can't. And we're often asked in the 4-year process to push them off into another budget cycle. Well, we're here at that other budget cycle to the point where now delaying capital purchase is a real risk. And we could talk about that in greater detail if you want. We've included anticipated wage increases. And then Code Zero, I'm not sure if that's a familiar term to everyone around the table, but that's really when you run out of ambulances. And Code Zero is becoming something that is routine, unfortunately, in this region. It's not something that's good for the region from any perspective. And when it happens in London, it's happened in Middlesex first, but it's happening more and more frequently across Middlesex, London. There's lots of good articles, lots of good stories on this. CBC Radio here has done a lot of great reporting on the impact of Code Zeros, and this is a risk that we have to address. It's also a very high cost because when Code Zeros happen, we have to bring in ambulances out from other parts of the region. There's a higher cost for those ambulances from Elgin, Huron, and Oxford and Chatham than there is for the ambulances that we use within our own system. So we have both the cost investment we need to make in Code Zero responses and also a risk mitigation issue. Just to put the land ambulance budget in perspective, we're really talking about the addition of 2 24-hour vehicles in 2020, replacement of operational capital, investment in system support and oversight. You'll see that there's training associated with those new staff members and risk mitigation strategies. Here's I'm not sure, well, the graphic's not terrible, but you can see that from a perspective of frontline resources, it's hard to find something there that isn't frontline resources other than insurance and fees and charges. So everything else, this is the increase broken down into where the increase is going. Where is that investment going towards? I really, Your Worship, I'm excited about this slide the most, obviously, because I think that if we don't work together on this, we're going to have some challenges and that are not going to go away. They're going to get worse. Your staff have been fantastic at working with us already on many things, but we have to promote some common solutions together, and we can't do it without you. So getting control of dispatch is number one. That is something that would have a huge impact upon our ability to manage our resources better. We need to help with offload delay investments, and what I mean by that is we need to encourage the province together. This is not a solution we can implement. All we're doing right now is putting Band-Aids on a very, very big problem. We need the province to work towards making more offload delay investments. Pooling is something that Martin and I have been talking about for probably a decade. He can explain more about that to you maybe at a later date. But getting pooled, I have a lot of sympathy for the challenges that London faces from a budget perspective because you are the primary care center for the entire region. There's a cost to that. You shouldn't be bearing that cost alone. We're bearing it with you, but you shouldn't be bearing that alone. And that applies to a number of different areas, number of different service areas, but especially in land ambulance, we're seeing that the cost of being a primary care center has obviously, there's a benefit of being the regional, for all of Southwestern Ontario Regional Healthcare Center, but there's also a significant cost from a land ambulance perspective. And Martin and I have been talking about how pooling like they have in the GTA might be an answer that we should be talking to the province about. There's several policies we can work on together. And then there's also the land ambulance review. I think it's January 16th. Is the date that yesterday I was with the Deputy Minister responsible for the health unit restructuring and also land ambulance restructuring. I was with her for about 4 hours, and I was also with Mr. Jim Pine, who is the municipal advisor to the province on both of these issues. They're going to be, you're going to get an invitation. It's going to be invitation only event for the city and the county to come together and talk to both of them and the ministry about land ambulance review and where it's headed and what you'd like to see, also health unit review and what you'd like to see. it would be fantastic, in my view, if we were working together and had a common message about let's invest in some of these things together. Let's make sure that we understand how we're going to control our costs going forward and what the province needs to do, because that land ambulance review is a real opportunity for us together. And then working together, I've lamented I'm really, well, upset, I think is the right word, that something we put in place for information provision in real time for your staff, and also so that they could give you better data about where we're going and what the needs are in the community, and participate in the decision-making, was that Management Oversight Committee. It helps everybody understand the risk, it helps everybody work together on solutions, and as I've mentioned several times, I think it also provides the opportunity for us to make better governance decisions on land ambulance. And somehow, we need to get that MOC together again. Your legal department really didn't like it at a certain point in time. Maybe there's different thinking now, but I would certainly encourage council to work towards that, not only for land ambulance, frankly, but I think it would be a fantastic, we have provisions for it in our agreements, but we need that also for social housing, for childcare, Ontario Works, and land ambulance. Information provision in real time, back and forth, decision-making together is the answer that will keep me from having to come back here and have this type of conversation over and over again, and it will also help us find solutions together. And I think we need to make investments together for cost control and service improvement for our residents, and we can talk more about what some of those might be. Your Worship.
Thank you, Mr. Rayburn. We had discussed a 20-minute presentation, and it was 20 minutes to the moment.
Oh,
so
sir.
thank you very much.
Oh, wow.
We appreciate
Internal
it very kindly.
clock.
Internal handling. So with that, we'll look for any questions that colleagues may have of Mr. Rayburn with respect to this.
I have to do this?
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you. I had a few questions because of some comments that were made. One, the challenges with dealing with a multi-year budget. So just my question to staff then, what ways do we have to deal with the changes that were suggested there? And they said it's difficult to predict, and that may happen going forward if we're asking them to prepare a multi-year budget. So how can we deal with some changes that might be happening with land ambulance during the 4 years?
So I'll be back to staff. Ms. Barbone.
Thank you, through the chair. So with respect to the multi-year budget, we have the annual update process that we utilize for any changes that occur. So I think in 2019 specifically, the land ambulance did bring forward an amendment that we brought forward as part of the update through that process. I can't recall offhand if there was more than that, but certainly that option is there, and that goes for any of the service areas or any provincial changes that might occur, is that that's the flexibility in the process to be able to adapt for things that we could not foresee coming.
Councillor, are you satisfied with that?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I wanted to ask about the big jump in call volume. So you've described a couple of things there. Was there anything unexpected about that? Are we getting calls that really shouldn't be coming to you? You talked about triage as well. And dispatch. Can you give us a sense of how things might change, or do you expect this trend to just keep growing almost exponentially as it is?
Mr. Rayburn?
Yeah, it's not exponential, thankfully, but it is growing for sure, and it will continue to grow. It's just a matter of what rate. And I think your first question was, were you caught off guard by this? Unquestionably, we were caught off guard by this. And because on our strategic plan, we had budgeted for a much lower number of call volume increases for over the 4-year period. And there's probably a myriad of reasons why. I mentioned some of the challenges that are happening within the community that are even just contact points, not necessarily calls that result in going to the hospital around mental health and drug challenges and some of the challenges that are out there in our community on a daily basis that I think all emergency services are responding to. But the aging population, just the call growth is probably related to population increases as well. There's a number of factors that are leading to call volume growth, and I certainly certainly expect to see it continue. I'm hoping that this year is a real anomaly, and I'm hoping that that's why I'm budgeting for just over 6% for next year in terms of call volume growth, because I'm hoping it settles down and we revert back towards some of our predictions. But right now, it doesn't seem to be trending that way, because as I mentioned, we haven't even really felt the impact of cold and flu season yet, and that will be significant when it comes.
Counselor, you're good?
I didn't mention, oh, sorry, the triaging, but that is a situation where it would be, we do need to do a lot of work, and I mentioned my first priority is to get access to controlling of dispatch, because there is a tendency to over-triage calls, and if you could get a better triage tool in place and get some of those calls that are maybe not necessarily at the level that they're triaged at, that would certainly help reduce the number of calls that are coming. We're working on a number of other factors as well that we can talk about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just one last question. You talked about code zeros. Do we respond very often to code zeros from other communities?
That is our only
Sure.
response, that is our only available response is to, oh, sorry, to other municipalities. No, it's more rare. It does happen, but it is primarily, like, if you go to, I'll actually send you a link to a great story about the Ottawa situation with code zeros. It is primarily a primary care center challenge. It does happen in other communities, and yes, we do cross-border delivery in other areas. Whether they're always for a code zero or not, I'm not as familiar with, but it is a much more a problem for London, Kingston, Ottawa, and the GTA than it would be if you're in Chatham and, in Windsor, it would also be a problem, yes.
And maybe if I just one last thing, are there things that people shouldn't call an ambulance for? Is there's something that they do often and you would suggest they not?
Mr. Rayburn?
Well, I would never suggest someone not call an ambulance because that's a risk, and certainly the base hospital would, and some other people around the table would be unhappy with me if I said that. But certainly we do have, I would say to you this, we have frequent flyers, a large number of frequent flyers of people that we are servicing that there are other ways to deal with those calls. And I would point you towards community paramedicine. This is an investment we need to desperately make in our community in a greater way than it is. We need to work with the province on helping them understand how that will reduce call volume, how that will actually improve health within the community. Getting direct transfer for people that have challenges that are related to mental health challenges directly to a mental health facility, as opposed to going to 2 or 3 emergency rooms before that happens. There's all kinds of things we can do together to help address those things to reduce the number of calls going forward, put greater efficiency in the system. We can't do it by ourselves, honestly. We need your help.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have, I'll stick with a couple of questions. But first of all, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Rayburn, for being here. I think it is really important for us as a city to understand the increases and where the county stands and the reasons why. So thank you very much for coming out. Also, I totally agree with your last statement in your presentation about the importance of working together. I think that is something that we need to sort of understand each other's perspectives and how we move forward. My first question, therefore, is about the MOC. If you could expand a little bit on that. In your presentation, you talked about the composition of base hospital being 1, city being 3, and county being 1. Does that exist? And just a little bit of history on this.
Mr. Rayburn.
Thank you. That's a great question. So it is a function out of the mind of Dennis Merrill and myself, who sat down. He was the original person responsible for land ambulance, Kathy remembers, and we sat down and said to ourselves, we can't deliver this to this elephant-sized municipality without having their input. Why would we want to? And we also need to understand better what their challenges are. And so we did, your composition description is perfect. That's what we did. We wanted to make sure we understood what the hospital was dealing with and what the city was dealing with so we could make better administrative decisions. So it was an administrative recommendation decision-making body that is unique. It was unique, is unique. I don't know of anybody else that does it, but it's actually in all of our agreements that we have for CMSM services. It's in there for social housing, Ontario Works, childcare, and for land ambulance. The history is that at some point in time, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have any other way of doing this, I don't have the documents in front of me. I think that what happened at a certain time in the history of the administration here, they became nervous about administrative people making recommendations for a service you're not responsible for. And what happened was, Martin's in a better position to give you your side of how this happened, but all I know is that we ended up sitting by ourselves around the table, and that's not terribly helpful whenever you're trying to provide information. I can tell you, and I think Martin would agree, that we worked the best possible, most efficient way administratively during that time period when we had it in place, because I didn't have to come and have this conversation. Martin was responsible back in those days when he was treasurer to come over and say, here's the challenges, here's why we think, and we also recommended this together. It was fantastic. It was something that they're going to write stories about and people are going to write thesis papers on, and it's really sad that it's gone. But I'm hopeful that we can get it back.
Councillor?
Thank you. And my second question relates to the impact of the formula that you came up with. And you mentioned provincial funding, call volume, and the assessment ratio. Given the challenges with where we are with the provincial government and the reviews that they're going through, how did you deal with that portion? And is that, if you can expand on that formula that you use with the provincial funding that we're really not sure is what it's going to look like, and how did you come up with that number?
Mr.
Right. So another great question, because the formula, I often hear, and it's not anyone's fault, I often hear, well, the land ambulance budget is going up by X. Well, yes, the land ambulance budget is going up by X, but it could go up 2 or 3X because of the impact of the formulas, which you've quite rightly pointed out. And how have I dealt with it is by waiting till I know. And the problem of what I mean by that is waiting till I know what the provincial amount is going to be, waiting till I know what the call volume ratio is going to be, waiting till I know what the assessment ratio is going to be. In fact, that's what our agreement says I'm supposed to do. I'm not supposed to be here right now. I'm supposed to send you a bill when I know in March what your last year cost was. I'm here as a courtesy, but that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. And there's a reason for that, is because this formula for how we allocate costs, I don't get that information until the new year. And when I hypothesize about what might happen, the front page of the paper says, oh my goodness, there's going to be a 32% increase. There might be. There's no way of knowing any of these ratios right now. It might be really lucky and there's a 32% increase in your costs, or it might be 16, or it might be some other number. I have no way of knowing that right now, especially the provincial funding ratio. I already acknowledged that the call volume ratio and the assessment ratios are going to change simply because there's been significant swings. But if you look at how our formula is derived, and I gave you a slide about that, they have less of an impact. Provincial funding is massive because there's a lag to that. And so what I mean by that is they pay a year after you have something in your budget. That could be huge. Initially, whenever we first started talking to your staff about what the impact might be to a municipality, I'm in the same boat. I'm here tonight wearing a Middlesex paramedics hat, but I'm not that tomorrow. I'm the CEO for the County of Middlesex. I'm going to be answering the same questions to my council that you're asking tonight. And it's a very difficult thing because the provincial funding ratio is something that is a complete unknown. When we first started talking about this, they were talking about a 2-year lag in formula. That was massive, and cap, and a reduction. Then they went to, no, now it's going to be 1 year with a cap. Then they went to 1 year with a 4% increase. And these are all just words because, as I mentioned earlier, it's a grant. It's not something they have to do. It's not a formula. It's what they feel. It goes to Treasury Board every year, and then we get told in March what that's going to be. And it's hard to say to you, here's what your allocation is going to be when the swings in call volume are that high, assessment is that high, we got a reassessment period, and especially in provincial funding. I don't know how I could tell you for next year, and I don't know how I could tell you for 4 years. So I wait. And that's why we're doing our budget in March for this particular service.
Councillor Hopkins? Good. Councillor Lewis?
Thank you, Chair, and I have a couple of questions. I'll start with the first one, through you to Mr. Rayburn. If I look back over the last few years, and particularly just the last multi-year budget cycle, although it might be a challenge, the city's been billed pretty close to what was budgeted for. Over that time, have you been running surpluses or deficits, and if you do, what happens to that money? Does it go into a reserve fund if there's a surplus? Do you draw down from reserves if there's a deficit? How does that work? That financial piece is sort of the first question I have.
Mr. Rayburn?
Yes, sir. So what we've been doing for 4 years is having a contingency for reserves. Sometimes we haven't been running surpluses, no. What we've been doing is actually trying to manage the service costs towards those estimates, but we've been budgeting for use of reserves. Now, that's a really bad idea. Martin and I and Annalisa all agree on that, but there was a number of times where we were pushed in that direction, in my view, to use reserves as a contingency instead of budgeting to go forward with an amount that's equal to where we saw some of our costs going. So I think that in the future, I admitted I fell on my sword. I think you were there, Councillor Morgan, when I fell on my sword and said, I think I was too nice. I was really trying to make this 4-year process work. And Annalisa already said, you know, there's opportunities, but I think we felt an internal pressure to move back towards those estimates that we gave you. And then what's happened is the gap between service and the cost increases has grown to 15-some%. And now we're here today saying, well, we can't simply do these mitigation efforts anymore. So I mentioned earlier, like even in equipment, we were buying extended warranties for equipment instead of buying new equipment. You can only do that for a certain amount of time. And then you're here today.
Councillor?
Okay, so thank you for that. My second, I guess a little bit of a clustered question here, because it's got a couple different components, is really more operational. And I hear what you're saying about the call volumes. So I also hear what you're saying about the capital. I know that in the slides it indicated 2 new 24-hour ambulances coming online. Are those the only 2 ambulances we'll see over the 4-year projection, or are there other ambulances scheduled to be brought online during this budget? And actually, I guess I'll let you answer that one first, because the other one's about call volume and is a little more complicated. So just in terms of ambulances, how many will we see?
Mr. Rayburn?
So we've, in our 4-year estimates, we've added 2 ambulances each year of those. So this is a number that's really about this year, this 2020 period.
Okay, thank you. So that's, we're really talking about 8 over the course of this budget period. With regard to the call volume then, and I certainly, I appreciate what you said about paramedicine. I think that that's a really important point. The city itself and this council has certainly endorsed the core area action plan, which will certainly, we have great hope will take some of the pressures off of all of our emergency services. EMS in particular, we hope will have fewer call volume concerns related to substance abuse and overdoses and those kind of things. But when you're talking about your call volumes, do you have a sense, even a ballpark, because I know this might be a hard number to nail down, what percentage of those call volume increases are related to substance abuse and addiction, and do you see, or have you taken into account in your projections that offsetting that we are projecting to see through initiatives like our core area action plan?
Mr. Rayburn?
No, I'd like to get back to you on that one. I think that that's a difficult type of number to provide you because of the definition, but I'll see what I can do.
Councillor?
I think that that's helpful, and if we could get a sense of that, because I think that we would like to see, you know, the opportunity to transition some of those calls off of the land ambulance volume and into alternate service providers. So if we could get at least a sense of that, it might help in our deliberations in terms of, obviously, you've seen the stack of business cases we have before us and how those might impact our decisions moving forward.
Councillor Van Meerbergen?
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to focus on what I think you're terming offload delays. Am I correct? That's when the ambulance and the paramedics pull into a hospital, typically the emergency department. They bring the patient in, and sometimes they're standing there for hours on end. And that ambulance is more or less parked there, out of service. That to me seems like such an incredible waste of very expensive resources that can only drive the costs up, obviously, and get to a code zero for London, because all these resources are stagnating, more or less. That photo, I thought, told a lot, with all these ambulances parked out of service. So what is being done to try and correct this? And clearly, it can't be done without the province / Ministry of Health, hospitals. Are we taking that team approach, and are we looking for solutions to that, what I think is a huge problem?
Mr. Ribbon.
So I think, as I mentioned during the presentation, it feels to me like the last, I'm not trying to be partisan, but the last provincial government used Band-Aids and for many things related to offload delays. And that was great because at least it slowed down the challenge of offload delays. Like offload delay nurses is a perfect, or a waiting, sort of these offload delay nurses where they have the ability to be looked after not by 2 paramedics in an ambulance, by a nurse. Fantastic initiative that slowed down the challenge. The problem is that the challenge is growing faster than that Band-Aid solution can work. So then the next thing that happened was they tried to do emergency room restructuring. And they spent a lot of money, a lot of investment in the hospitals. I'm talking about the previous government now, in emergency room restructuring, a small fortune in trying to make that work. Again, unfortunately, the problems continued to grow and to get worse. Now, I'm not in a position to say whether worked or not, but I know the problem's still getting worse. So you can make your own conclusions. And now we're starting to see other initiatives, like the councillor asked about direct transfers, and where you, or fit to sit is another type of initiative that I think is another good one. There's a lot of these things that are small, and really what we're talking about that is causing this is the backlog at the hospitals that is then you're seeing at the front door, which turns into this. And there's a lot of work that has to happen beyond our work, which stops at it goes to that front door, that goes into the back, that is really only at the provincial level that can be solved. And the people in this room need to come together and say, we've done everything we can Band-Aid wise. We now know this problem has continued to grow. Let's all hold hands and work together on trying to find a solution to this, because that picture is not abnormal.
Councillor.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you for that. No, and the fact that it's not abnormal is what's so concerning. Because, I mean, I've heard it from friends, relatives, I've seen it myself, where you see wheeled stretcher from the ambulance, one after another in the hallway, all this expensive equipment, the ambulance is parked doing nothing, and these talented, well-trained staff that are standing there, until these kinds of things like this are solved in terms of finding a solution, I think we're just going to be revisiting this at every budget.
Are you looking for a comment from that, or was that your comment? Do you have a brief response, Mr. Ribbon?
I'm not known for those, but yes, I think so. I think there is an argument to be made that you could be investing more dollars in ambulances that are going to get sucked into the system. You know, I've heard this argument made, and that's the kind of argument I'd make if I was just the funder. But as the funder and also legislatively responsible for the service, we have a legislative responsibility to provide services that are there and make sure that we are not sucking resources from other areas that are more costly. And so I totally agree that I'm going to keep coming back to you and talking about offload delays. For a long period of time. It's been 18 years now. I've been talking about offload delays and their challenge. And all I've seen is Band-Aid solutions. We really need together to, when, on the 16th of January, go there with a plan and talk about how they need to invest at the back end in hospitals, so we're not doing hallway medicine anymore, and we need to do that together. And that's the only solution.
Thank you. Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. I have a couple questions. The first is, I know you had a slide called the path forward. I don't know if you can flip to it for me. So I think I agree, this is an important slide, because I think there's certainly opportunities to work together, because I mean, we have some questions about projecting our own costs, but there are certainly costs in the system that collectively we both bear, and I think the focus on the work together to try to find ways to deal with those costs, whether it's provincial or whatever, is a good opportunity for us to come together and work together, either, you know, with each other through the Land Ambulance Review or through, you know, the agencies that we both attend, like AMO and Roma or anything else, Good Roads even. Anytime we have a chance to meet with, you know, ministers and government officials to talk about the problems with offloading. But I also see an opportunity potentially with this provincial government and the pressure that they've tried to put on municipalities. Certainly they haven't, you heard, they're not helping us in some cases, and you know, with our budget process by the cost pressures. But they also put together, you know, potential sources of financing, which I know the county and the city have both taken advantage of through the Audit and Accountability Fund or the Municipal Modernization Program for small municipalities. So on here, I didn't see anything related to like an efficiency review, and I wonder if you're interested in applying to the funding that is available to conduct, you know, irrespective of the challenges we know are there, just a general efficiency review of the system to try to look to make sure we've done the cost down, and do that with someone else's money, in this case the provinces, because they're asking us to do that. So is that something that you have done or would consider doing in the future?
Mr. Rayburn?
Yes, so let's answer the first one. Have we done it? Yes. Over the course of the time we've been delivering land ambulance service, we've done it several times. Be glad to show you what the results of those were, because they've actually produced fantastic results around new initiatives using technology. There's more we want to do. Like, I mean, we can talk about, I'm going back in time now to when we started using GPS in this system and monitoring how our ambulances are moving and those types of things. But the predictive tools around calls is something that I'd love to invest in. We learned that from doing these efficiency exercises. So yes, yes, and yes. The good news, though, and I've said this, and I was pleased to hear one councillor, at least around the table, say, this is really isn't about whether this is an efficient service, because I think there's a widespread belief across Ontario that the Middlesex London Paramedic Service is one of the most efficient services. I think by any comparator, I love to brag about the efficiency and effectiveness of this service. By any comparator, it is a very efficient service, and I think that it's hard to argue with. But we can become more efficient. We've tried a lot of different things to become more efficient. I just think that the biggest bang for our buck is on this page you've already identified, as that's where the big dollar items are, where we can have the biggest bang for our buck, but I'm always willing to look at doing more.
Councillor?
So I am interested in working together on this. That's been my comments in the media after I attended the county council meeting, and I'll continue to do that. I know we've recently made appointments to the city county liaison committee. I'm one of the appointees, so I'll look forward to having discussions there. But the development of the MOC, I think, is certainly something that I think we need to discuss and see in what way that can be reconstituted that you know, meets all of our needs, and that'll be an opportunity to discuss these sorts of things. The one thing I do want to say is, I know at the county meeting, you talked about some comments that were made at one of our meetings as, I can't remember the words you used, but not being helpful, perhaps interpreted as hurtful, whatever the language was. I can tell you, too, the discussions back and forth, I think in the way that it was articulated about us desiring the numbers and you having them in the building, I would say, you know, wasn't doing any favors to the perception of our staff, who are doing a very excellent job of trying to project into our budget numbers in our regime to make sure that we're accountable to Londoners. I fully recognize that you have the legislative responsibility for the service, and we pay a bill. But we have a financial obligation to our taxpayers to explain, you know, why we're paying for the things that we're paying for. And so we do have a need, to a certain degree, even though we're not responsible legislatively for the service, to really understand what's going on in the service and do our best job of explaining to Londoners why we're paying what we're paying and where we expect their tax dollars to go over the next few years. So although I recognize all the challenges that you may have, there's got to be some way that we can come together to make reasonable estimates with the data that our staff need for us to fulfill our responsibility to the citizens of London, while recognizing the flexibility that you may need in not being held to, you know, some unrealistic standard about meeting those, and using our annual update process to make adjustments where we aren't off on our predictions. Again, I fully hear everything you're saying about the challenge with predicting, but it seems to me like that is really what I know our staff need is for us to be able to answer those questions about the bill we're paying and be able to make reasonable projections in our budget. And it seems to me like that's not money the information that we have yet. And on the DC side of things, and potentially funding this through DCs, we need like 20 years of predictions to be able to actually move some of this into a DC space and try to offset some of our tax burden on this in a different way. It seems to me like you're saying that would be next to impossible, which is unfortunate because there's really a funding envelope that we could potentially take advantage of if we could find a way to make some reasonable predictions that would stand up over time with some flexibility for adjusting them.
Mr. Raybert?
So let me clarify my hurtful comment, because I think you're taking it a little out of context. The parts that were hurtful was whenever someone says it would be nice if we got information in real time, and they're the ones that got rid of that mechanism. So that's hurtful. I think that it's hurtful whenever there's a suggestion that there might be a use of funds more for the county for stations per capita than in the city. That's hurtful. That's not the type of dialogue that leads to really finding solutions. And I don't think it was to be extrapolated into the information provision that we've already done. I'm here tonight. I've been here lots of times for as many hours as is necessary to provide information. I think the unfortunate part is when I hear things, I did listen to those, every member of council listened to that committee meeting and heard that it said, well, they're not getting call volume, they're not giving us call volume information. We tweet that out at the end of every week. What I can't give you is the call volume ratio, which is, you know, you said about information you need, that's what you need for your formula. I don't have it till February. I don't have the assessment information until the reassessment's done. I don't have the provincial number. So I get what you're saying. I'm right there too. Tomorrow, I'm gonna go back and be working on this on my end, and I don't have that information for me either. So that's a problem. And we've done our very best to give every piece of information that we can. The challenge is, and even back historically, the challenge is if that information doesn't exist yet, I can't give it to you. And that's the information you need. And I'll just finish, Mr. Chair, by saying, this is, like I said, I love to brag about this service. And we're very transparent about what we're doing here. And we would love to have you have more information about it. Just don't take that mechanism away.
I'm good for now, Mr. Chair, but I might circle back.
Thank you. Councillor Lehman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Rayburn, for coming today. I think what we're feeling and you're hearing is a frustration regarding governance because we pay a considerable portion of this bill. We look to see where we're making contributions to decisions being made. Can you tell me over the last 4 years, what's been the average increase in this cost?
Ms. Barbone, and if you've got that or could get access to that, please.
Sorry, through the chair, from over the multi-year budget period from 2016 to 2019, the average percent increase was 7.5% for the city share.
Councillor Lehman.
So I'm just trying to get my head around understanding the governance. My understanding is that there was an MOC for a while and then it went by the wayside. So is there a board now that dictates and passes this budget?
So, oh, sorry. Well, I think we're mixing a few things together, and that's understandable because there's there's governance and there's administration. On the governance side of on the side of the equation, the responsible party is the council for the County of Middlesex. That's who's responsible. Likewise, who's responsible for social housing in the County of Middlesex, childcare, and Ontario Works is the City of London. It's not me. Because when CMSMs were set up in 1998, that is in the province's wisdom what they did. It's been a fantastic model that's worked really well in my view, to be honest, whenever we've had good information sharing back and forth. And so that is the responsible party from a governance perspective. Some of the frustration you're hearing from me is, I haven't had the chance to go to that governance body yet. So you have a governance concern, yes, that's fine, but you haven't even had the governance process work yet. As I mentioned in my presentation, as an administrative person, I haven't even had the opportunity to go to my body, that's my governance body, and say, have them challenge the budget at its current state, which is an administrative estimate, the way it should have before we come and have this discussion. I'd be glad to come back and have that discussion then too.
Councillor Lehman.
So my understanding is that you would put the budget together and Middlesex County as a council would pass that.
Thank you.
One of the, oh, sorry, Your Honor, Worship. From what I hear for you, it's been challenging for you to come up with a forecast because it's not until March when you do yours. And the biggest portion of that, is that correct?
Sure.
Wrong. Oh, not really. Not correct. I think it hasn't been challenging for us to, it hasn't been a challenge for us to do a land ambulance budget estimate. For the most part, what's been challenging, and we've given you one, as an administrative body. It hasn't gone to any governance review yet, but Annalisa gave you a number earlier, and I think what she was talking about, because I think she said it, is that's your contribution increase. That, as I mentioned earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean that the budget for land ambulance went up that amount. It may have, I'm not gonna argue that. But there's a difference between your contribution amount, because of the formulas, and what the land ambulance budget is. So what I'm having trouble with is not the land ambulance budget estimates. I'm having trouble with your contribution amounts because of all those unknowns I mentioned earlier. And that is usually something I can't answer until March.
Councillor Lehman.
Yeah, I understand that from what you said in previous comments, the funding formula, while there is call volume, et cetera, the biggest thing is the province. And is that you will not know until March, is that correct?
Sure.
I actually won't know any of these things on the slide, those three things, until the new year. So I won't know the assessment ratio, I won't know the call volume ratio, because I get that from provincial dispatch. If I ran dispatch, then I'd have it in real time. And but those are less of a concern to me than the provincial funding ratio. That is the biggest concern. That has the biggest impact on what your cost will be.
Councillor.
So in the last few years, have you seen a dramatic change in provincial funding formulas?
Mr. Abraham.
We've seen it go down and we've seen it go up. I'm sorry, you said 2 years, did you? I'm sorry. Oh, my.
I'm just trying to get a history. So I'm trying to see how you arrived, because you don't have that funding formula. You're giving us like a 15-point-something% increase. You must have based that on some anticipation of what the province will be declaring in March. And I'm just seeing how you arrived at what you used. Is there a dramatic shift in the last few years, a volatility in that formula? Or are you programming in a big projected increase? And if it doesn't, then are we going to see a big decrease in what we're being billed?
Mr. Abraham.
So whenever, the answer to your question is that you asked the question about how did I arrive at a number to ballpark that? And I didn't do it by myself. In fact, the number, in fairness to your staff, I've given them several different numbers as I've heard pronouncements from the province. So you asked about volatility. Yes, between the start of the year and now, I think I've heard 3 different formulas with 3 different legs and 3 different percentages for caps. So there's up and down and all around that have traumatic swings in what costs could be for the municipality. So what I did was I sat down in November, I explained those risks to Martin and Annalisa and said, what do you think we should do? And we talked about what the level of risk might be associated with picking a percentage increase, going with a 1-year lag and a 4% cap. We did all that together and talked about it, and then I came up with that number, and they know the risks that could happen if the province doesn't come through with that. And, you know, I was asked a really good question by one of your councillors. What happens if the province doesn't pay the amount that you expect them to pay? Well, that definitely goes back onto the city and the county, because that's a grant. I've said it several times, it's a grant, it is not a formula, and that's part of the problem. You can go to the, I'm not sure, sir, if you were at the AMO conference, but you went to the, if you did go to the AMO conference, there was a pronouncement there about what's going to happen with land ambulance. I have not, as a provider of the service, one of the largest providers in Ontario, seen anything in writing that would clarify. And so I'm still working from the last letter I got, which is 2.5 times worse than what they said at AMO. I was with the deputy minister yesterday for almost 4 hours. And I asked, when are we going to know what is happening with land ambulance? Because that is creating some uncertainty and risk in how the service is provided. And of course, there is no guarantee that that is going to be in place anytime soon. Traditionally, they let us know in that early part of the year, February, March.
Councillor?
Last March, did you see a dramatic shift in provincial funding formula?
Mr. Rayburn?
Well, I think if you would have asked me that question 6 months ago, I would have said yes for sure. I would have put a lot of money on that. There seems to be less willingness or appetite for that now, and that's just pure hypothesis, which is I think what you've asked me to do. I think that there's less likely, we've heard calmer tones around funding reductions. We've actually even heard them talk about funding percentages increases, which we didn't hear early last year. So I think there's less likely, which is why I was able to lower my estimates after we talked in November.
Councillor Lehman.
Just a final comment. I think we should get an MOC or some form of county, city, formalized process. As I said, I think the frustration we have here, not just with councillors, but I think with staff, is that we are not sharing information, we're not involved in decision-making, and yet we're paying a good portion of the bill. And that leads to distress, it leads to frustration, especially in these budgetary challenges we have right now. It's even heightened. When things are going smoothly, then fine. But I think, as we can see, things always don't go, they always don't go smoothly. So I'll look forward to progress on that.
That was a statement. Thank you. Councillor Pelosi.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to our presenter, Mr. Rayburn, thank you for joining us this evening and for your presentation. For those who know, recently my son was ill, and we certainly did call upon an ambulance service and was grateful that there was no code 0 at the time. As certainly a parent in distress, I cannot imagine waiting any longer. So that is concerning, and I've certainly been at the hospital and seen the ambulances lined up in the bays as well for extended periods of time. I appreciate the systemic factors that you've outlined within your presentation tonight. My question's two-part. I'll put it out there to answer as you will. I've heard members in the community say that, you know, you could call an ambulance if you have a question. I know you don't want to speak to when to call an ambulance and when not to. That's a personal decision. But some saying, hey, you can call an ambulance, they can come check you out, and if you don't take the ride somewhere, there's no cost. So if you can't or don't want to get to a doctor and have a question, that could be an option of who to call. So concerned knowing that we're already having a high saturation of calls of some people considering that as an option. And wondering if that's a concern for you, or if you're considering the community paramedicine of right care, right time, right place, that would be okay to take that approach. So just looking for your feedback on how that might affect our code 0s and the budgetary constraints that come with it.
Mr. Rayburn.
Well, I think I'm concerned about erosion of public trust in the system. And the more times we have code zeros, the more times we have call volume delays, the more times people drive by and see the picture that I put on the screen. I think that does erode trust in the system, and people should be calling for an ambulance when they need one, and they should be trusting the system. And I know that whenever I have a gap between call volume and the staff resources that has reached 15 point some %, to make sure that there's that trust in the system, I need to put those resources in place. And so that, though, is only part of the solution. The other part is, how do we work on mitigation strategies? My mother is a big fan of community paramedicine, and she lives in Ilderton, and it's a fantastic way. I think you must know a little bit about it because of your comment. It's a fantastic way to, across the province, start making sure that we're using resources in the right way and using, as the mayor said, or as someone said, very expensive resources in the right way. And we need to right-size that, and that is going to require coordination. It's going to require the city and the county working together, and the province, and that's what we need to get onto, certainly very soon.
Councillor? Thank you. Councillor Turner?
You got me without my hand up. Thank you, Worship.
We can just have you just do nothing then.
It's quite all right. I'm I'm happy to have the opportunity. I didn't know we'd gotten through the speakers list. Thank you, Mr. Rayburn, and Ms. Burkhart-Jessup, and Chief Roberts for coming tonight. Very helpful to have you here. Very helpful to have some context to I guess, a number rather than just the number. We have some stuff built out to that. I think a lot of great comments from my colleagues talking about the need to work collaboratively. I have a motion that seeks to figure out how we might increase our involvement with the operation of Land Ambulance Services in its governance. It's funny, you'd mentioned that papers and theses would be written about this. I actually wrote 4 papers on this for my master's, so it's something I know a little bit about. I want to touch on a few things. Councillor Lehman was just recently asking about that the 15.9% increase and how that worked with the funding ratio. The provincial funding ratio between municipalities and land ambulance is traditionally around 50-50. There's some variance in that from year to year, as Mr. Rayburn talked about. But that maintenance of that ratio is really important. There are other municipal provincial funding ratios in other service areas as well. And that's, a lot of those came out of downloading back in 98, 99. So to try and figure out how do municipalities and province work together. The 15.9% is an increase in the budget. It's not necessarily an increase in how much more the funders will pay. So for clarification to Councillor Lehman's point is the budget itself in 2019 was $37.9 million. A 15.9% increase to the overall budget for the operation of it goes to $43.9 million. Now, if the province continues to fund at the rate that it has, if it matches and actually increases the amount that they contribute to the service, to the operation of the service, so if they also give 15.9% more, then that's where we're at. The province pays 15.9% more, the municipalities pay 15.9% more. Mr. Rayburn had talked about a letter that was received from the province back actually in, it said here, back in May, or April, I believe. It doesn't have the date on this letter, but nonetheless, it says at that point, the one that was most recently received by Mr. Rayburn, was that the province was freezing funding levels to the ambulance service at the 2018 level. So that was going to be a challenge, which now meant that there was going to be an increase in dollar responsibilities to the municipalities. Your Worship, I'm going to have a lot to say if I might be able to ask right now for an extension.
Well, why don't we get to the end of the 5, then we'll ask for an extension, okay? I think that's approved. Away you go.
Thank you. I just saw the wrap it up, and I'm like, there's a lot to go here. Anyway, that was important. At AMO, the minister, I believe it was the Minister of Health, announced that there would be a 4% increase on the 2019, which kind of relieved some of that fear. But as you heard, the average increase over the past 4 years has been about 7.5% on the average of the 4 years. So that throws that ratio off a little bit. If we get to a situation, as the grant letter had stated back in April, that the province is going to freeze its provincial contribution, and we move forward with a 15.9% increase in the budget, that really shifts the responsibility of those costs onto the municipalities. And that's where we get into a situation for the City of London, the overall increase next year would be 29%. For the County of Middlesex, the increase would be 33%, which is pretty significant. In fact, for the County of Middlesex, there would be, just on the 15.9% increase on the base budget increase, that's a $507,000 increase to their base budget. Last year, there was a $70,000 increase to their base budget, to the net levy delivered budget. So that's over 7 times more than what they paid last year in an increase. And if the province doesn't come to the table, they'll have to pay an additional $550,000. For us, that means an extra $2.173 million. So we heard how in the budget presentation, the impact of land ambulance costs are 0.4% on our net budget. That's based on about a $2 million increase in the contribution from the City of London. But if the province freezes its contribution and the County of Middlesex approves a budget that increases the land ambulance budget to $32 million, or by 15.9%, then that's an additional $2.2 million to us, which is an additional 0.4% on our budget before we've even finished doing this. So I think it's really important for us to reach out to the County of Middlesex and ask them to contain costs in the land ambulance budget to such a point that it's consistent with what the province has signaled that it will deliver. Mr. Rayburn talked about not knowing those pieces of information until the spring, which is quite right. And I think over the next little while the land ambulance consultations happen, we're going to get a bit more of a signal of where the province is heading and how it's going to build its budget. We're not passing our budget until the beginning of March, so we may have some more clarity over the period of time, and the County of Middlesex will be building its budget over that time as well, and recognizing a lot of the cost pressures that it's going to have on its budget. So we might have some more clarity on it, but I think it's important for us to ask and reach out to the county and say, can you seek some assurances in the funding ratios that the province will match any increases that we're proposing, and that the county maintain that ratio and limit any increases to that amount.
Is that a question? No, I'm not stopping you. Is that a question for Mr. Rayburn?
So I guess through you, Your Worship, to Mr. Rayburn, is that an appropriate strategy for us to take, recognizing there are a lot of question marks through this budget?
Mr. Rayburn, a lot packed into that.
Yeah,
what do you think?
I was going to get a chair there for a second, but I think we're good with you asking whatever questions you want, and I wouldn't advise you otherwise. I think, though, where I have the biggest question actually is, and I've asked this question, and I think you know I'm in pretty regular contact with the Ministry of Health folks on a number of files, including a lot yesterday, and there may not even be answers. You know, I think you, I don't think it's telling tales at a school that Councillor Turner and I had a bit of a beer summit on this issue of what's happening with land ambulance costs moving forward, and in that he said, you know, do you have anything in writing, or could you ask for things in writing? That just doesn't happen. And I think that on the 16th, it's a great opportunity of January to say, you said you're going to cap at 4%. Now, I read that letter differently than you. I didn't read it with any cost above 4% per service is going to be capped at 4%. I didn't read it that way. In the past, when they've said that, what they mean is that the overall funding envelope will be, for the province, will be capped at 4%. Doesn't mean that individual services can rise or fall within there. And I think there is, as I mentioned to several folks, I'm really proud of this service, but there's lots of comparators out there. Like our closest comparator from every angle, from households, when I say ours, I mean Middlesex London's, is Simcoe County. Their budget in 2019 or in 2020 is projected to be 58 million. We're projected to be 43 with these increases in 2020. I think we should be going to the province and saying, hey, look at our comparators, look at how efficient we are, look at the gap between our call volume growth. We can't do that as Middlesex County. We can only do it together and say, yes, I know you said the provincial fund is going to be capped at 4%, but here's the argument that should be made about why these resources should be going into Middlesex London. And so, sir, that's what I'm proposing is that we do. And how you put that in your motion, I guess, is fine. I mean, I haven't even had the chance, as I've mentioned yet, to go to council and talk to them about this types of stuff that we're doing. I feel really awkward about that. But I'm looking forward to that opportunity because they're going to be asking many of the same questions that you are.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you. That's helpful. One of the challenges is that this is a really significant impact to both the City of London's budget and the County of Middlesex's budget. There are cost drivers that, well, as we heard, a 7.5% average increase. The average call volume increase for EMS has been between 7 to 10% a year, and will continue like that until, frankly, there are fewer baby boomers, and then we're going to start to see call volumes decrease a little bit. Sorry, I hate to put it that way, but that is the driver. More than 50% of ambulance calls are for those over age 60. That's the central point to it. A few initiatives were identified in the discussion about how do we divert calls. Fit to Sit is one where we can liberate ambulances quickly from offload delay, or more quickly from offload delay. Looking at community paramedicine programs works upstream to try and prevent calls from ending up at hospital if they can be treated in the community rather than at hospital. I want to ask a little bit about the legislative change impacts of destination protocols. I think those are coming online shortly, if not in the process of being done, which will allow ambulances and paramedics not to go to emergency rooms, but rather to mental health facilities, urgent cares, or even treat on location and refer. What's the anticipated impact of that on call volumes and demand?
Mr. Rayburn?
So I just want to put on the record I'm a Gen Xer. Another thing I'd like to just mention from Councillor Turner's comment is that the increase in call demand over the last 4 years has been a total of 20.82%. The increase in staffing has been 5.11% over that same time period. So that's where we see this net difference of about 15.71%. I haven't given you that chart yet, but I will. I'll send that out to you, Mr. Chair, and then it can be distributed. And getting back to the specific question about, so we're really excited about we've been asking for this for several years, and it's unclear to us how much of an impact it will have. I think we'll have to have some experience with that. And I'm almost reluctant to predict because I predicted great things from offload delay nurses, and my offload still went through the roof. I predicted great things from emergency room changes. My call volumes and my offload challenges still went through the roof. It is another Band-Aid. It's just not the ultimate solution, but we'll work to get you a number on that you're looking for.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you. And through that, you identified that over each of the next 4 years, that the anticipation is to add 2 additional 24-hour ambulances. Each ambulance represents about $1 million in operational cost. So that adds about a minimum of $2 million in each of the budget years, which is fairly significant impact. You'd mentioned that if you were just the funder, you might just make the argument that those ambulances will get sucked in. But even from an operational standpoint, my concern is that where we have a picture of about 15 ambulances at the parking lot of Victoria Hospital, that each year we're just going to add 2 more to that. The rate limiter of the availability of ambulances in the community is based on how quickly crews can get through the emergency room. And if the funding that is being allocated here is just to put resources into the community on the streets, it's moments before they're sequestered in the hospital for, I believe an offload average is about 3 hours. Somewhere, I see maybe a little bit less, yeah. But still a fair amount. and then sometimes up to a full shift, depending on how low a priority that call was. The challenges I identified before is that group of people where the bulk of calls are in the middle of the triage scale. Low priority calls are able to sit in the waiting room. High priority calls get seen pretty quickly in the emergency room if they're life-threatening. It's on a 5-point scale, these 3s end up sitting, and they're the ones who are just chronically ill. Diabetes problems, digestion problems, those kind of things. And those tend to be the ailments that are associated with those who are 60 plus. So if we're just adding resources at the one end, then I don't know if it addresses our problem. And a 15.9% increase in resources this year, plus an additional 2 ambulances in each of the years after that, I worry that we're pouring money into a problem that's not going to be able to resolve itself. How do we reconcile that?
Mr. Rayburn, I think that's a question to you.
Yes, sir. So I think we should have more discussion about that theory, that's what happens. Because it's not free whenever you see that in there. When you talk about those ambulances being sucked in, as you know, that's $2 million a year. But when they're all there, the system doesn't stop. It's drawing resources in from other areas, as you know, and there's a higher cost to that. So we should have a debate or a discussion about whether or not it makes better sense, especially whenever the cost of that, as I think you know, is much higher to get ambulances from other areas. It increases response times whenever we have to do that. I think it's a debatable point, the theory that you're putting forward, and I think that we should have a greater discussion about it. Certainly, I know I'm going to get asked that question at my own county council, and I'm hopeful that I'll be able to convince them as a legislative body that it's not only more cost effective, but also less risky. And I think you would agree it's less risky to have those resources to match, to increase towards where we've fallen behind towards total call volume. And then we could have a better discussion about the theory that you have that they are just going to get sucked in at no benefit, because I don't believe that to be true.
So I know, Councillor Turner, that you indicated you've got an amendment you'd like to put forward, but if you don't mind, I've got a couple of folks we haven't heard from. And if need be, we'll circle back. Councillor, Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. Through the chair to Mr. Rayburn, and I just want to recognize, I see the chief over there. I imagine he's wanted to jump in on a couple of these questions. A bit odd having the fellow who actually runs the service in the audience and not at the mic, but I appreciate it. And these are really budget questions, so I think it makes sense that Mr. Rayburn's answering them. In terms of the call volume, I just want to make sure, because sometimes you see different numbers reported. You know, there's the actual calls for service, and then sometimes a higher number, which is sort of like calls that were for service but weren't actually dispatched, you know, so sometimes you see different numbers. So for 2018, I think that's the most recent year that's like closed off, you know what the total was. What is the actual number of calls for service?
Mr. Rayburn?
Not sure. So I'm not sure why we're asking the operation. Like, so I just want to get back to your premise that it's odd, because really I thought that what we were here to do was talk about the budget submission and not about operational issues. We'd be glad to come down and come back and talk about operations. In fact, we've offered several times to do Ambulance 101 where we talk about operational things. And certainly I am responsible for the land ambulance service. I am responsible for the budget. Be glad to get you any information. We've given information to your staff about call volumes going backwards. I don't have that number right in front of me, but we can certainly get it for you.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go with what I saw in the 2018 EMS performance report, which was 60,840. Does that sound like it's about right for 2018? Okay, and so the reason I'm asking is because I'm trying to reconcile the call volume growth, which obviously is a main driver of the cost drivers that we're seeing, and the budget growth that we've been seeing, right? And so obviously there are other things that are gonna affect the budget, right? Like people are gonna negotiate collective agreements, they're gonna have increases in their wages, there's all kinds of things. Gas is gonna be more or less expensive, there's different things, but there's quite a big gap between the growth in call volume and the growth of the budget. And I really want you to try and explain to me sort of why that's happening. So the reason I say that is that, so I'm looking at 2015 to 2023. Right, so those are the two multi-year budget periods. In that time period, the City of London's contribution, if we were to approve this budget, it would go from $12.35 million, that was the budget back in 2015, to $29.3 million in 2023. So that's a 137% increase in that time period. Like, that's a lot. And then we know the call volumes are increasing over this period. There's rapid increases. We had pretty significant budget increases in the last multi-year budget, you know, around 5%, depending how you count it, a bit higher when you factor in assessment growth. We made some assessment growth changes last year, like $1.4 million on 15. That was another significant increase. Some of it was assessment growth, some of it was mid-year adjustments in the multi-year budget. If I were to take the 9.5% that you're seeing so far in this year and say, okay, that's gonna be for this year, it could be higher, it could be less, and then take 6.3, which is the budget for 2020, and just say every year after that, it's gonna be 6.3, which is a high number. I don't know if it's gonna be higher than that or not. Over that same time period, we're talking 68% increase in call volumes. So, like, the unit cost stuff would add a lot, I'm sure, because it's a long period of time. But the difference there is pretty big. And I honestly don't really understand how, you know, you can have such a huge budget increase on top of what is the sort of fixed costs for the collective agreements that are going up relatively slowly over time. And then even if we assume pretty significant call volume increases for the periods we don't actually know what the call volume increases were, it's still a lot. Like, it's like 137% to 68%. So I'm having a hard time with the budget numbers and understanding how we could be doing that. Even if we're looking at 9.5 and then 6 or 7 every year, why are we doing 15 as the annual increase over the period? So, you know, I listened to your presentation very carefully. I still don't get it. I don't understand why it's increasing at that kind of rate. It's so much higher than what you're seeing on the operational side.
Mr. Rayburn.
So thank you. I'd like to break your question down into 2 parts. The first is, I just want to make sure we have an understanding of this. Do you understand that the budget could be at 0% increase, the estimates could be at 0% increase, and yet the costs for the city and the county, or the city in particular, could go up by double-digit percentages?
Deputy Mayor?
Yes, I do understand that.
Okay, good. So then your question is, how can these be increasing beyond the level of call volume increases? You said there's a lot of other factors that, like, we're focusing on a call volume. I think that's a bit of a mistake because population increases also have an impact. There's a number of factors, as you know, that are not just related to call volume, but there are several other factors related to how we allocate costs that could, without any percentage increase in the budget, still impact on the numbers that you're talking about. In fact, twice you negotiated freely agreements with the County of Middlesex that changed the formula for how the costs are allocated. So there's lots of different ways, to answer your question, there's lots of different ways costs can increase for the City of London without there being $1 extra spent, or there's lots of ways that the provincial number could change where you could have cost increases. In your specific question about for this year's budget, I did my best with this chart to explain where the cost increases are going. They're not going to anything else other than frontline services and resources for that. That is a match towards what we've seen as a lag between the call volume increases that we've seen compared to the staffing and resources over the last 4 years. And I apologize for not giving you this excellent chart that I have right here in front of me that isn't in this presentation. I just did it today, but it shows over the 4 years the answer to the question about call volume increases versus service level increases. And that is why we, as an administrative body, put forward estimates to try to match against that. And so I don't see anything on that list really other than 1 or 2 things that isn't really about frontline services to try and match call volume.
Deputy Mayor?
Thank you. I think I heard you in the answer to someone else's question talk about the difference between the number of people who are out on this road providing service and what has been happening with other measures. Can you just repeat what the headcount change was? So I think you said 5% a year? I'm not sure. You made passing reference to it.
Mr. Rubin?
I think maybe you might be referring to that you're the 5th fastest census population, because I was talking, well, maybe, I don't have it right, obviously.
No, so you were talking about how many FTEs have been added, and you were making the point that it's been lagging the sort of
Mr. Rayburn?
Yeah, that's a chart I'd like to provide you. I think it shows that pretty well. And I think that it would make sense whenever I do that to talk about, I think you might be referring to when I said that the increase in call demand over from 2017 to this year has been 20.82%. The increase in staffing was 5.11% for a net difference of 15.71. I'll give you that chart to the chair at the end of the day.
Deputy Mayor?
Thank you. And I think you said 2017 to 2019, is that right? So 2-year period.
Mr. Rayburn?
So 17, 18, 19? Yes. Okay.
Deputy Mayor?
Okay, so, you know, I look back at the budget that we approved for land ambulance back in 2015. And just to give folks a sense, we had an increase of about 12% in FTEs, full-time equivalents, in the budget. Then we did the assessment growth increase, which was, so there was about 1.4 million added additionally last year. And about 60% of that was assessment growth. The rest was property tax levy. So that was on top of what we had put into the original budget. And so I just want to make sure I was tracking the numbers appropriately to make sure, because it seems like you should be able to add more FTEs than what you had said, but I think maybe I got the number of years wrong. So I'll think about that a little bit more. Okay, I want to talk about assessment growth, because we have dealt with some of these pressures in the past with assessment growth. It was really just last year that I'm aware of. I can't recall in the previous couple of years that we really had a lot of land ambulance assessment growth cases. And I wanted to ask a question through the chair to our treasurer about how we plan to accommodate some of these growth-related pressures. Some of it is, you know, the population's needs are changing. It's not necessarily more population, but there definitely is increases coming from population growth. And I wonder, I know we're not going to deal with assessment growth till later, but it's all related. And I wonder if the treasurer could just speak to that.
Ms. Barbone?
Thank you, through the chair. So 2019 was the first year that we did allocate a proportion to assessment growth, and that was working through the county and trying to look at what the city's share was and trying to determine how much of that budget increase for the city was attributable specifically to growth. This year in particular, because we have not a great deal of information in writing, I have a gross number, so we've been able to, based on the information that they've provided links to through their county council and AMS meetings, was to look at the provincial funding that we made some estimates on to try to determine what our share was. Based on the gross estimates that they've provided. So based on that, the chart that actually is up there that shows the increases, I don't know amounts that are attributable to those. I just have percentages. So there's nothing that I can specifically and accurately, to the depth that we normally do for our assessment growth calculations, because as you know, we do a business case and we do some very, very detailed in terms of determining how much of that increase. So the city's share specifically for 2020 is a 26% increase over 2019. So in order for us to be able to definitively put a portion of that towards assessment growth, I would need to determine how much of the city's share is specifically attributable to growth and trying to figure that out. So without all the information that we've had previously, it would be an arbitrary allocation in our respects to put that through the budget process. So certainly we know intuitively there's likely a share that is attributable to growth. The question is, how do I calculate that? And I don't have enough information to be able to come up with that definitive calculation.
Deputy Mayor?
Okay, in the absence of that, I think I'm just going to use in my mind sort of what we think the population growth was until I hear otherwise that it should be higher or lower than that.
Bear with Mr. Rayburn. I'll ask, had you finished your thoughts and you're looking for a comment? Just bear with me, please.
I'd love to hear from Mr. Rayburn. Go ahead.
Please go ahead, Mr. Rayburn.
I'll give you my number. You can call me and we'll talk all about this. But we did provide, actually, after our meeting with Martin and Elisa, the growth-related numbers for the next 4 years based upon our estimates. So that is in an email that the city did receive, and that should answer, you shouldn't have to hypothesize about that, I agree. We did our very best to talk about what, and how we do that as we look at what's related to new stations. What, you know, you can imagine the analysis that we do. That certainly was in an email that the city has, and it, I hope it will answer your question.
Well, it sounds like Mr. Rayburn's got the information, so what is the answer?
I don't have it here in front of me, the growth numbers that I have, but I'd be glad to send them to you. I thought that Annalise would say, well, it's from this email, but we'll make sure that we communicate better on that in the future.
So just a case in point, you've already prepared it before, we can expect to receive that. Ms. Barbone, you wanted to respond?
So through the chair, I do have that email in front of me, and based on that email, it specifically shows that the gross budget for 2019 is approximately $43 million, and $6 million of that is the increase on a gross basis. So based on a number that is here, it is showing that the growth in service demand is approximately $4 million of that related to 78% specifically, and that the legislation and mitigation pieces. So they've broken it out between growth, legislation, and operational. So that is on the gross basis, and certainly we could attribute the 76% of our share to that. That's not typically the way we would do it, but certainly that would be one way that, you know, from that increase, that would likely wipe out most of our assessment growth for probably the most part of next year. So it is a really significant number from that perspective. We typically apply a lot more rigorous metrics to it, but based on that number, we would use a 78% of the city's increase is attributable to growth.
Deputy Mayor?
Okay. So in the absence of a lot of like the detailed information about what's going on with the service, you know, I think we have to rely on what's available publicly, right? So I went and downloaded all the reports to Middlesex County Council over the last few years. I would encourage all my colleagues to do the same. You know, just go there and take a look at what's going on in the service. I'm just going to make a few comments. I am sympathetic to the problem of a particular service that's got very specific challenges that are driving up costs beyond what's normal in other areas. And I think we have to recognize that all the services are different. This particular increase is very significant, and we were fully aware that this was an area that was increasing at a rapid rate in the last multi-year budget. We had a pretty long discussion about it in the multi-year budget process. We had a special presentation at CAPS. I can't remember which year it was. I think it was right around the time of the multi-year budget process, where we got into a lot of the details. And I think the county and Chief Roberts were very clear about, you know, this is an area where we have a lot of pressure. But I never would have imagined that we'd be dealing with 15.8% annual increases for this kind of time period. And like, it's just, that's too much. It's too much. So I think we have to figure out how are we going to manage this kind of pressure over that time period? It seems like the assumptions that are being made is that the formula is going to stay the same, basically, in the absence of knowing anything else, which I think is the right kind of assumption to make, right? I don't want the province to change how they're funding the land ambulance. If anything, I want it to go the other way. You know, I'm on the AMO Health Task Force where we talk about this stuff all the time. Like the amount of things that the municipalities are talking about in terms of healthcare is very significant. And I think we have to recognize that the province has really got a lot of responsibility in this area. I know it's not legislative responsibility, I know it's a grant, but you know, I don't want to give them the sense that they could just reduce funding and the municipalities will pick up all this difference. Because 15.8 is what it's looking at now without big changes in either of the call volume or the splits between municipalities and the province. If we're dealing with a split on top of that, which is the situation we have in transit where they've made some changes, it's going to be even worse. And so I think we're going to have to really think hard about how we can influence this. Obviously, people want the service to be great. And I think if you look back at the performance reports from the last few years, I think that's what we have. Like the service has been really great. And it seems like in 2019, a lot of things are colliding and creating a lot of uncertainty around, you know, how much resources need to be added to get the response times to be to a level that people want, is meeting the public expectations. And I think we may have a situation here where, you know, there's enough uncertainty that it's hard to nail down in our multi-year budget what's going to be a really accurate number. And I think we're going to have to work together back and forth. One thing I will say through the chair to Mr. Rayburn is in your presentation, there were a lot of people who were at fault, but I did not hear you taking responsibility yourself for what is going on. And you did that when you were answering one of my questions. You did say, I'm responsible, I'm the guy. And I think you know that, but the presentation, it sounded like, you know, it's the city treasurer, they should never have backed out of the thing, and, you know, we should have worked better together, but it's all kind of passive aggressive, blaming other people. And that's how it came across, and I honestly, I don't think it's helpful.
Mr. Rayburn, perhaps you'd like to comment?
Perhaps I would. I don't know. I think I did say, Councillor Morgan was at our presentation. I don't think, I would ask you to ask him after whether that's the case about the presentation I made to County Council, because I'm sorry you missed it, but I said I made a lot of mistakes in understanding the 4-year process and how it worked. I fell on my sword several times around, hey, we shouldn't have tried to use reserves as we were asked to try and use reserves, because that is a fiscal mistake going forward. We can talk more about why that's a fiscal mistake. I think I should have fought harder whenever I was told that we weren't going to have the ability to share information the way we had before. I think you should look at the County Council presentation. I said that again tonight, that there are lots of things where we could have done better in terms of making sure that you understood better what is going on with the service, no question. If you want to call that passive aggressive, I understand, but and I'm disappointed that you think I'm blaming someone here for that. I'm talking about what we did and what information provision was provided. You asked a specific question about growth. I think I answered that. I thought we had provided that number. I still think we provided that number for the 4 years. So I'm disappointed by that characterization, but I understand your perspective.
Deputy Mayor, any other response? Councillor Cassidy. You didn't. I'm so used to that, though. You know, Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you. My first question is about the call ratios that you wait for annually. It seems to me that probably the easiest thing to do is try to get those on a semi-annual basis. What are the odds that that could happen?
They're fantastic if we had control of dispatch, because you'd then be able to get that information. This is something that I think, even going back to the days when we had the MOC in place, we all were in agreement that should happen. The municipality should be able to decide where those resources go and where that information can be used in real time to help lower costs. I talked about predictive tools. That's hard to use unless you have access to that real-time data. So instead, what we have to rely upon is a bit of a data dump that then has to be scrubbed from the ministry at the end of the year, usually in that first or second week of January. So in terms of, I don't want to use any blaming language, but there certainly is a challenge, because whenever part of the formula is call ratio, it's impossible to predict without that information. So with dispatch, I think you get that information.
Councillor?
Okay, can you, I've got about 2 more questions, but could you just briefly, for maybe me or the people at home, describe how it would be different if you had control of the dispatch?
Mr. Rayburn?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because I think that control of dispatch really allows you to manage your resources in a completely different way. I think you could imagine a taxi service where you don't have a dispatch center and what the results would be. And that is really what we're up against. We're not able to ebb and flow the use of resources. We're not able to manage how calls are triaged the way that we would like to see. It's a long list of things that getting control of dispatch improves. We actually have a really good paper on getting control of dispatch and what it means for efficiencies and effectiveness. And maybe, Mr. Chair, it'd be a good document as well to share, because I think that is a good long conversation.
Councillor.
Thank you. My next question is about the extra ambulances we're asking for. So 2 ambulances every year, 8 in total. How much would we have to reduce the offload time in order to make those additional ambulances unnecessary?
Mr. Rayburn.
Well, I think the cost of I think Councillor Turner already talked about the cost of ambulances per year to be fully staffed. And we know that the cost of offload alone is $2 million. There's a lot of costs that are associated with offload delays that are beyond simple the cost of those services. It's also we talked about the impact upon staffing. We talked about the impact upon calling in other resources. So I really think that if you want to equate it to offload delays, a ratio of how much you'd have to reduce, that it's really $2 million a year that offload delay is costing the system.
Councillor?
Okay, and thank you. Now, just a projection for technology. Do you see telemedicine playing a role in triaging emergency medicine in the future?
I certainly see.
We've now changed your profession, I think, but go ahead, Mr.
Yeah.
Rice.
Yeah, well, there are great examples around the world of doing dispatch differently that do impact upon calls. I actually had the opportunity several years ago to see a dispatch center in Sussex, in England, and they have tools within the dispatch center to do triaging and paramedicine in some respects right there in the dispatch center, and the results and the efficiencies that were created by this were enormous. And so there are several examples around the world of better dispatch centers that would help with impacting upon call volume and impact upon providing better health care to our citizens.
Final question, Mr. Councillor?
That's fine. So I think that the dispatch, if we look at an end game, that seems to be the direction we should be thinking, but it might be an expensive one.
I have no one else on the list. I'll look for any final comments. Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thanks again for the presentation. I do want to praise the incredible work of Middlesex London Paramedic Services. 60,000 calls a year in our communities is no small number, and they respond to them professionally with high level of training, and as Mr. Rayburn said, a very efficient service. I don't think there's any debate about that. I didn't hear that come up for discussion around the Horseshoe. I think that's something that's acknowledged by everyone. There's a few factors that lead to the costs. One's population growth, one's call volume growth, one's the inflationary costs, and the last one is labor costs. Those are all factors. Those four factors are the ones that are going to play with the costs of delivering this service. I think we've heard that we've historically been providing increases on a year-on-year basis that are somewhat consistent with call volume growth. 7.5% annual increase average over the past 4 years in budget contributions, and between 7 to 10% increase in call volumes. We might be a little bit behind in that, but it seems appropriate that we would look at inflation plus call volume as those two factors of saying, how do we move over the next few years to find the right size? 15.9% is completely disproportionate to that, and is a big challenge. We've already found ourselves, actually, I will ask one quick question if I might through you, Your Worship. The other question came around to development charges. Councillor Morgan talked about use of needing 20 years of forecasting. When I worked at Oxford County Paramedic Services, we did have access to a DC reserve specifically for ambulances. What would be required for us to be able to build some sort of DC funding mechanism in towards paramedic services?
Mr. Rayburn? Oh, let's ask Ms. Barbone instead.
Thank you, through the chair. So the very first start to build the development charges is to do the DC background studies. So in order to incorporate that in, those are the studies that take place in advance of the development charge work that we begin a few years in advance. And that starts with laying out the plans and trying to identify exactly what all the needs are in the next 20 years along with estimates. And we have consultants and we do a lot of that work in advance to lay everything out. And then that is the starting point, once those are all completed, to begin the DC study.
Councillor?
Yeah, thank you. So that's helpful. So using assessment growth and DCs are things that can help smooth the curve a little bit. I hope that both bilaterally, one internally with the city staff, that we can start to investigate what tools and mechanisms we can use to be able to offset some of the superinflationary pressures that are associated with paramedic service delivery and are associated with growth and aging populations. And the second is that I hope that the county will be forthcoming with the information that's required in order to build those. And so those are kind of two asks. I won't put through a formalized motion though. Having worked for the past 10 years in a number of agencies that are grant funded, provincially grant funded, as we prepare the budgets and year on year, we take a look at what we think will happen with the provincial funding the subsequent year. And we build our budget around that. And knowing that the province has given every signal, in fact, in a letter, that they were freezing budgetary contributions, then if I were in an agency that received a letter like that, then I would look to freeze the budget for the subsequent year, recognizing that there might be pressures, and I might look to other mechanisms or assurances to say what that funding is. The funding formula and ratio is really important for us, and if we see a freeze in provincial contribution, we move the 50-50 formula to a 56-44 formula, where the municipality, and that is impossible to come back from. It takes years and years and years to get it back to 50-50. And I'm not ready to take on additional costs from the provinces after they've just downloaded $6 million on us for next year. This would be an additional $2 million on top of that. That's a fairly significant impact. So I have a number of motions that hopefully try to address to that. I've circulated those before, so you had a chance to consider them and perhaps propose amendments if required. So the motions are that the following actions be taken with respect to the Middlesex London Paramedic Services budget. A, that the mayor be requested to submit a letter to Middlesex County Council seeking, 1, consideration that any approved increases to the Middlesex London Paramedic Services budget match the budget dollars provided by the Ministry of Health. So that means maintain the 50-50 funding ratio, or knowing what they're going to be. And then 2, that the current funding ratio for the province and the municipalities for the provision of services be maintained. So really important to maintain that 50-50 ratio. B, that the mayor be requested to submit a letter to the Minister of Health seeking clarification as to the level of funding that would be provided for inflationary and service level increases for the provision of paramedic services. So we have some opportunities with the consultations coming up to be able to press upon that urgency. C, that the Civic Administration be directed to investigate and report back through the Community and Protective Services Committee on options that might be available to the City of London to increase the city's involvement in the management oversight and service delivery functions of the Middlesex London Paramedic Services. So that was to Mr. Rayburn's point. And D, that the presentation from the Chief Administrative Officer of the County of Middlesex and Chair of the Middlesex London Emergency Services Authority be received.
Is there a seconder? Councillor Hillier. Any final comments or questions that haven't been covered? Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. I think Councillor Turner's motion is a good idea, and I generally am supportive of it. The reference in part I about the approved increases, the sort of unit of comparison is budget dollars. And although the province provides around 48, 49%, 50% of the budget, the City of London does not. And so I don't actually want our contribution to match the city in dollars. I think the idea that you're saying the percentage increase should be the same. So that I support. And I actually would say not exceed the percentage increase that the province is providing. So I think maybe that should be an amendment.
I am comfortable with that. That was the intent. If it can be worded better, exactly why I hope to have the opportunity to have the discussion.
Perfect. Any other comments, Deputy Mayor? Thank you. Any other comments or questions with respect to the amendment on the floor? Councillor Morgan.
Yes, with respect to the amendment on the floor, and I want to preface that with, I know Mr. Rayburn has sat down, and I know there's county officials here too. I did want to say, irrespective of my comments earlier, where we had a bit of a conversation about the debate and the way it went. I certainly am thinking that a key part of this is the collaboration piece. I know it's not directly, particularly in Councillor Turner's motion, but I think that there was a clear statement that we want to work on maybe reestablishing the MOC. We want to work on controlling some of the costs within the service itself. And so I don't want that to be lost in the motion. I think that's a key part of the discussion today. I think at the end of the day, I appreciate what Councillor Turner's attempting to do. I think that, the challenge that we have as the municipality, irrespective of the components of this motion, is that the Treasurer has outlined a budget table today that's going to collect $12,869,000 to try to cover land ambulance service over the course of the multi-year budget. And Mr. Rayburn's basically said, I can't really give you a sense on what the bill is. It might be a little higher, it might be a little lower than maybe we're projecting. It's really hard to raise tax dollars in that particular environment to try to do that. So I appreciate that Councillor Turner is trying to establish some definity around, that's not a word, but sounded good though. Certainty around our contributions. We're still gonna have the challenge of being billed for this. And what we really need at the end of the day too is to know whether we're collecting the right amount of tax to provide this service. Like, that's what we need to do in the budget. That's really important. And so these are, I support what we're trying to do, but at some point we have to find some mechanism to get a reasonable estimate for whether we're collecting enough tax to pay the bills that we're gonna have at some point. That's really important. So I don't know how we get there, but to me, that's a key takeaway that we have to solve in collaboration.
So, Councillor Morgan, just to be clear, I'm not hearing a specific reference to amend the motion, but a future reference to deal with some of the issues you've referenced. Is that fair?
Yep.
Any other comments with respect to the slightly improved motion with respect to what is on the table? Moved by Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Hillier. Any other comments or questions? Colleagues, I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 14-0.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Before we go to the next item, firstly, to Mr. Rayburn. There you are. Thank you very much. This was an extended discussion. I knew you had a prior family commitment that you deferred to ensure that this happened, but on behalf of council, we appreciate that very much, and we appreciate your responses with respect to the queries that were put upon you. Can I also add to Mr. Roberts, there were some very thoughtful comments about Middlesex London EMS, and please extend those through to the team, because I think they're well deserved. And finally, Warden Burkhart Jessen, come back anytime, and we're delighted that you're here today, so thank you for that. I'll look for any, I'm not aware of any items for direction or deferred matters or additional business before we adjourn. I'd like to thank staff, as we always do in these meetings, because of the great work that you do. And we are very grateful and appreciative of your efforts, and you take council's sincere appreciation for that as we move into the holiday season, because I think that's the next piece of that. We all have some work to do over the next little while, but thank you, and to the members of the gallery for being here. I'll look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Van Hol, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer. Let's do a hand vote on that. All those in favor? That looks unanimous, mostly. Opposed? Carried. Thank you very much.